The night air over Yankee Stadium hung heavy with breath and noise. 64,000 people filled the stands, their cheers rising like steam into the frozen dark of December 1958. They did not know they were watching a turning point in the history of American sport. They only knew they were cold, anxious, and alive, their eyes fixed on a field that looked more like a battlefield than a playing surface. Mud streaked across uniforms. Hands trembled from the cold. Helmets carried the dull reflection of the floodlights. Somewhere deep inside that chaos, the future of football was being written. The Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants had traded blows for nearly 3 hours. Every yard had been fought for as if it were the last on earth. And yet, in that brutality, something new was beginning to emerge, something invisible. It was not about strength or speed anymore. It was about thought. It was about control. When the fourth quarter began to die, the crowd's noise began to thin, replaced by an almost sacred hush. What came next would not just decide a championship. It would change the nature of the sport itself. The quarterback was a man who had once been told he was not good enough. Johnny Unitas had worked in a steel mill when the NFL first turned him away. He played semi-pro ball for $6 a game. He was the face of resilience, but also the embodiment of something else that would soon define football: calculation. He saw the field differently. He processed, sequenced, planned. He was not reacting to chaos. He was organizing it. As the clock wound down, Unitas walked into the huddle with eyes that seemed distant from the noise around him. The game was tied. He called plays not from the sideline, not from a pre-written script, but from memory, logic, and instinct fused into one. He was playing chess in a world that still thought it was checkers. Each throw, each decision, was not a guess. It was architecture. That drive, the one that carried Baltimore down the field and into history, was the moment when football began to think for itself. It was the first time the nation saw a quarterback operate as more than an athlete. He became a conductor. Every motion of his hand carried design. Every call at the line created ripple effects. The game was no longer a brawl. It was an equation unfolding in real time. In that moment, you could sense a quiet revolution forming. It was in the way Raymond Berry adjusted his routes mid-play, reading Unitas's body language like a code. It was in the way Weeb Ewbank trusted his quarterback to manage time and tempo without instruction. It was in the way the Giants' defense under Tom Landry countered with formations that demanded anticipation, not reaction. Every piece moved with purpose, every decision layered upon the last. When Alan Amici crossed the goal line in overtime, sealing the 23-17 victory, fans poured onto the field. Amici, they thought they were celebrating triumph. They were celebrating transformation. The game they loved had just become something far more deliberate. Before that night, football had been a sport of intuition. Players reacted, coaches motivated. Strategy existed, but it was secondary to grit. The league was smaller, the crowds humbler, the broadcasts limited. The game lived in local papers and locker rooms, not living rooms. But in the winter of 1958, America watched as football became a science. It was the first NFL championship ever decided in sudden death overtime. It was broadcast nationwide, with millions glued to screens, hearts pounding in sync with the final drive. The drama was unprecedented. So was the precision. What Unitas did on that field looked spontaneous, but it was the birth of structure. That night marked a deeper shift than most realized. It showed that football could be studied, patterned, controlled. It introduced the idea that decisions could win championships more effectively than strength. It turned the sport from instinct to intellect. In the locker rooms that followed, something began to change. Coaches who once trusted emotion began to trust data. Film study became ritual. Plays were drawn with the care of architects. Quarterbacks no longer memorized plays. They internalized systems. The 1958 championship did not simply crown a winner. It rewired the way the game itself functioned. Looking back now, it is hard to imagine how quiet that moment must have felt after the roar subsided. The camera flashes, the shaking hands, the frozen smiles all fading into stillness. Unitas sat on the bench, his face calm, eyes lowered as if the noise around him belonged to another world. For the first time, a player had transcended the boundaries of athletic instinct and entered the realm of strategic command. From that silence came a ripple that would stretch through decades. The playbook expanded. The role of the quarterback evolved. Coaches became scientists, obsessed with formations, sequencing, and tendencies. Analysts dissected every frame of film. The human element remained, but it was now filtered through systems. In that transformation lies both beauty and loss. The sport gained structure, but it also surrendered a part of its chaos. What had once been an art of reaction became a discipline of preparation. Every moment on the field became part of a greater logic, and in that logic, emotion found a new form, contained, directed, but still burning beneath the surface. When the clock struck 0 that night, football, as it had been known for half a century, was over. The era of unplanned genius had ended. The era of design brilliance had begun. The NFL would rise from that foundation built on analysis, repetition, and control. But even now, decades later, you can still feel the ghost of that change every time a quarterback stands over the line, scanning the defense, deciding not just what to do, but why. It was more than a championship. It was a rebirth. It turned a violent game into an intellectual pursuit. It connected the mind to the muscle, the plan to the passion. It made football something that could be studied, debated, and perfected. And yet, in perfecting it, something ancient slipped away. The purity of raw instinct became a memory, preserved in grainy footage and fading cheers. The night the game began thinking for itself was also the night it began losing its innocence. What followed would be decades of innovation, obsession, and complexity. Every sideline call, every audible, every timeout traced its lineage to that single evening in New York. If you listen closely to the echoes of that night, you can still hear it. The hum of strategy beneath the roar of the crowd. The quiet calculation hidden behind every celebration. The sound of a sport learning to think. That was the night football crossed a threshold it could never return from. Before 1958, football was not yet a language, it was an instinct. It was a game of muscle and collision, of breath and grit. Plays were born in the huddle, not the laboratory. Quarterbacks barked commands. Linemen dug in, and what happened next often depended on intuition more than instruction. Football in that era was raw and reactive, a living organism that thrived on chaos. Coaches prepared their teams, yes, but once the whistle blew, it was men versus men, governed by instinct, courage, and momentum. But on December 28, 1958, something changed. Inside Yankee Stadium, as snow flurries mixed with the breath of 64,000 fans, football's primitive heart began to beat to a different rhythm. The 1958 NFL championship between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants would later be called the greatest game ever played. But that title only scratches the surface. What truly made it great was not the overtime or the drama, was the shift from chaos to calculation, from reaction to design. This was the night football began thinking for itself. To understand why that night mattered, you must first see the game that came before it. In the decades leading up to the 1950s, football was closer to rugby than to the modern chessboard of reads and routes. Substitutions were limited, meaning players went both ways, offense and defense, every down. Strategy was necessarily simple. Coaches could not build elaborate schemes when players were exhausted, their bodies breaking down on frozen turf. Games were wars of attrition, and playbooks fit neatly inside a single back pocket. The single-wing offense ruled the landscape. The quarterback was rarely the star. He was simply one piece of a grinding machine. Passing existed, but it was considered risky, almost undignified, a trick play rather than a foundation. Coaches like George Halas and Curly Lambeau built dynasties on power football. Handoffs, dives, traps, sweeps. Strategy was muscle memory. Execution mattered more than imagination. By the early 1950s, cracks began to form. Television had arrived, and with it, a new kind of pressure. Games were no longer played only for the people in the stands. They were staged for the lens. Viewers at home could see mistakes, patterns, and possibilities. They saw quarterbacks making split-second decisions, receivers breaking routes, linemen missing blocks. Football's primitive chaos was now being dissected by millions of eyes, and quietly, the game began to evolve. The NFL had begun allowing unlimited substitutions in 1950, paving the way for specialized positions. Suddenly, coaches could design specific plays for specific personnel. The concept of the system emerged. The one-platoon era was dying, and in its place came something far more precise. Into this changing world stepped a handful of minds who saw football not as a brawl, but as a blueprint. Tom Landry, defensive coordinator for the Giants, approached the game like a mathematician. His defense was not reactively, was anticipatory. He introduced the 4-3 defense, designed to account for the rising sophistication of offenses. Each player had a defined responsibility, each movement a purpose. Across the sideline, Colts head coach Weeb Ewbank was building the opposite, a machine that thrived on offensive precision. His quarterback, Johnny Unitas, was the architect inside the helmet. Unitas was not the prototype of a mid-century hero. He had been cut by the Steelers, worked construction jobs, and played semi-pro football for $6 a game. But what made him dangerous was not his arm, it was his mind. He understood timing, space, and leverage in ways that felt closer to geometry than athletics. His favorite target, Raymond Berry, was his equal in obsession. Berry was slow, unathletic by traditional standards, and nearly blind without his thick glasses. But he compensated with something revolutionary: preparation. He charted his routes in notebooks, memorized defensive tendencies, and adjusted every step until perfection became predictable. What Unitas and Berry represented was the new frontier, the rise of the cerebral player. They were the bridge between instinct and intellect, between muscle memory and film study. In an era where most teams still relied on gut and grit, the Colts built their offense around timing patterns, pre-snap reads, and spatial manipulation. It was football as architecture. Their opponent that night, the New York Giants, was a mirror image built from the other side of the ball. Landry's defense was designed to disrupt timing, to make quarterbacks doubt their reads. And on offense, the Giants were led by Vince Lombardi, a future legend whose power sweep and disciplined approach would later define the Green Bay Packers dynasty. Between Landry and Lombardi, the Giants were a team caught between two geniuses, each constructing a vision of football's future. That convergence of minds, Unitas, Ewbank, Landry, Lombardi, made the 1958 championship more than a game. It became a philosophical collision, a battle between instinct and structure, chaos and control. The Colts and Giants traded blows like heavyweights. The field was cold and slick, the grass frozen in patches. Players stumbled, helmets cracked, and breaths turned to steam under the stadium lights. The Giants led late, but Unitas refused to panic. What unfolded in the closing minutes was something football had never quite seen: a methodical, calculated drive in which every decision had purpose. Short passes to Berry, precise clock management, surgical use of the field. It was the birth of the 2-minute drill, executed not in theory, but in desperate reality. As the clock ticked down, Unitas directed his offense like a conductor leading a symphony. He was calm, calculating, already thinking 2 plays ahead. Berry ran routes like clockwork, each catch bringing the Colts closer to destiny. When Steve Mears' field goal tied the game at 17, the crowd roared, but something deeper had already happened. Football had glimpsed its future. Overtime sealed it. When Unitas led the Colts down the field one final time, mixing runs and passes with surgical precision, he wasn't improvising. He was executing a plan. The winning touchdown, a handoff to Alan Amici up the middle, was almost anticlimactic. What mattered was the process that led there. A team thinking strategically. A quarterback reading the field. A coach trusting his system. That night did not just crown a champion. It introduced a new kind of football. Television carried that story into millions of homes. For the first time, fans saw a game unfold like a drama with rising tension, resolution, and meaning. The broadcast showed how intelligence and structure could coexist with violence and heart. The league, once a niche attraction, suddenly found itself in the national consciousness. The next day, newspapers ran glowing headlines. Viewers who had never watched football before called it thrilling, even beautiful, and the owners took note. The 1958 championship made football a thinking man's game. It inspired coaches to break down film, to script plays, to analyze tendencies. It birthed the modern playbook, the thick, diagrammed binder that would become as iconic as the helmet itself. Coaches became architects, quarterbacks became field generals, and every inch of the gridiron became a chessboard. By the 1960s, the transformation was complete. Lombardi's Packers ran plays that looked mechanical in their precision. Landry's Cowboys introduced motion, shifting, and disguised coverages. Ewbank and Unitas refined the art of timing routes until defenders were always half a second too late. The league had changed forever, and it all traced back to that cold December night in Yankee Stadium when chaos became calculation. It was the night football stopped reacting and started planning. What unfolded in that game was more than the birth of modern play calling. It was the realization that intelligence could dominate instinct, that preparation could surpass improvisation, and that a quarterback could command not just a huddle, but the very geometry of the field. The 1958 championship was not the end of football. As primitive past it was the beginning of its engineered future. And while fans remember the touchdown that ended it, the true legacy lies in what began. A sport reborn as a system, a science, a spectacle. The field grew quiet after Amici crossed the goal line, but the echoes of that night never faded. From that silence came an evolution that would redefine every play called thereafter. Before the 1958 championship could reshape football, there existed a version of the sport that felt almost prehistoric compared to what came later. It was a world of dirt fields, stitched leather helmets, and playbooks that barely filled a few pages. Coaches carried whistles and cigars, not binders of analytics. Players went both ways, fence and defense, without rest, without rotation. It was a game of endurance and instinct, played by men who survived more than they strategized. This was the NFL before it learned to think. In the 1930s and 1940s, football was a working man's game. It was small crowds, smaller paychecks, and even smaller margins for creativity. The league struggled for relevance against baseball, boxing, and college football. Strategy existed, but it was simple and largely improvised. Teams relied on formations like the single wing or the T formation, concepts that had more to do with brute execution than innovation. A quarterback might call a play based on what he saw at the line of scrimmage, but the idea of reading a defense was still primitive. In those early years, coaches were motivators, not architects. They were disciplinarians who spoke of courage, loyalty, and heart. They emphasized toughness above all else. Players were expected to absorb punishment without complaint, to play both sides of the ball, and to think of victory as a product of willpower. Games were decided in the trenches by who could hit harder, hold longer, and endure more pain. Film study was almost non-existent. Teams that did record games did so with handheld cameras, often in black and white and without sound. Most of the time, the footage was used to scout opponents, not to refine their own play. There were no offensive coordinators, no situational analysts, no sideline communication systems. A head coach might call a few plays, But often, it was the quarterback or captain who directed the team's actions in real time. In essence, the pre-1958 NFL was governed by instinct. A running back cut, left or right, based on a feeling, not a read. A receiver adjusted his route based on desperation, not design. A coach drew up plays on chalkboards that resembled sketches more than systems. The game was reactionary, shaped by the immediacy of chaos. That chaos was part of the appeal. The players who defined that era were heroes of resilience. Bronco Nagurski, who played like a living, battering ram. Sammy Baugh, who threw the football when most were afraid to risk it. And Sid Luckman, who began experimenting with passing concepts under the guidance of George Halas. They were innovators in spirit, but their tools were primitive. They relied on courage where future generations would rely on calculation. Tactics in those days were often drawn from military imagery. The language of football blitz, trenches, formations came directly from the battlefield. Coaches believed in discipline and obedience more than creativity. When a player missed an assignment, it was considered a failure of character, not of scheme. Games were fought like ground wars, with limited substitutions, meaning fatigue was an unavoidable weapon. You played until you could not. The one-platoon system dictated that every player had to master both sides of the ball. A lineman blocked and tackled, a back ran and defended, and a quarterback threw and covered. Substitutions were allowed only in small bursts, so stamina often determined the outcome. This made intricate strategy impossible. A coach could not install specialized packages or situational plays because his men were exhausted and interchangeable. Simplicity was not a choice, it was survival. Even so, under the surface, the seeds of evolution were being planted. Coaches like Paul Brown began to imagine football as a science. Brown, who led the Cleveland Browns to dominance in the 1940s and early 1950s, introduced ideas that would later define the modern game: playbooks, practice organization, film study, and position coaches. He even pioneered the use of radio communication inside the quarterback's helmet, though the league would briefly ban it. Brown believed preparation could outweigh raw talent. His methods were seen as radical, even unnecessary, by many of his peers, but history would prove him right. Yet outside of Brown's laboratory-like approach, most of the league still clung to tradition. Teams like the Chicago Bears and Green Bay Packers built success on brute force. Passing was still viewed as dangerous. A completion was thrilling, but an interception was catastrophic. Coaches were cautious, often running the ball on 3rd and long simply to avoid embarrassment. Offenses were predictable, defenses were straightforward, and innovation was slow to spread. The fan experience mirrored that simplicity. Stadiums were modest, crowds often small, and broadcasts rare. Games were local events, not national spectacles. The league lacked the glamour or production of Baseball-esque, World Series, or college football-esque bowl games. The NFL existed in a kind of cultural fog, admired by the devoted but largely invisible to the nation at large. Players, too, were ordinary in their circumstances. Many held off-season jobs to make ends meet. A lineman might work in construction. A quarterback might sell insurance. They played not for fame, but for survival. Injuries were constant, medical care was limited, and the idea of a long career was almost unheard of. Helmets had no face masks. Padding was thin. The game punished the body relentlessly. Yet even amid the violence, the sport carried a certain purity. It was played with instinctual courage, guided by the moment rather than by meticulous design. There was an artistry to its unpredictability. A broken play might turn into brilliance. A missed block might lead to an improvised run that defied logic. The game's chaos was also its poetry. But by the early 1950s, the league stood at a crossroads. America itself was changing, technology was advancing. Television was reshaping entertainment, and audiences were beginning to crave sophistication. The NFL could not remain a regional slugfest forever. It needed structure, stars, and stories. And for that to happen, football had to evolve from instinct to intelligence. The one-platoon system's abolition in 1950 set the stage for that transformation. Now teams could substitute freely, allowing for specialization. Coaches could design plays that depended on specific skill sets, and players could focus on mastering one side of the ball. That shift opened the door for creativity, for the birth of systems like the West Coast offense and the 4-2-3 defense that would soon follow. But in the early 50s, those ideas were still forming, waiting for the right minds to give them shape. In this transitional moment, a new breed of coaches began to rise. They were thinkers more than motivators, analysts more than orators. Tom Landry was studying alignments and coverage schemes with the precision of an engineer. Vince Lombardi was dissecting blocking angles and timing with the discipline of a craftsman. Weeb Ewbank, a quiet student of organization, was building frameworks around execution rather than emotion. But before their philosophies could take root, they needed a moment of proving ground to show that football could be both beautiful and intelligent. That moment would come in 1958 under the glare of Yankee Stadium's lights, where instinct and calculation would finally collide. Looking back, the pre-1958 NFL feels like a different world altogether. The players were warriors, the coaches commanders, and the game a test of survival. But evolution was inevitable. Progress was already whispering at the edges of the field, waiting for a night when all of football's contradictions, chaos, and control, instinct and intellect would converge into something entirely new. It was the final chapter of football's primitive age, and the quiet before the storm that would change everything. In 1958, Baltimore was still defining what it wanted to be. It was a port city with an industrial heart, a place of shipyards, steelworkers, and stubborn pride. Its people understood hard labor and quiet endurance. They saw themselves in their team, the Colts, who played not with flash or finesse, but with a kind of blue-collar intelligence that reflected the rhythm of the city itself. The connection between Baltimore and its quarterback, Johnny Unitas, became something deeper than sport. It was the story of an underdog city finding its reflection in an underdog man, both determined to prove they belonged. Johnny Unitas did not arrive in the NFL as a chosen prodigy. He was not groomed for greatness, nor did anyone expect him to define the modern game. In fact, when he first tried to enter the league, he was rejected. Drafted in the 9th round by the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1955, he was cut before the season began. The coaches thought he was too slow, too thin, too unrefined. He returned home to Pittsburgh, took work on construction sites, and spent weekends playing semi-professional football for $6 a game. He lived in a modest apartment, borrowed his mother's car to get to games, and carried the quiet weight of unrealized potential. But Unitas had something that did not show on film or in scouting reports. He saw football differently. While others reacted to chaos, he looked for patterns within it. He studied how defenses shifted before the snap, how safeties leaned in one direction before committing, how linebackers betrayed coverage by their stance. His mind worked like a metronome, calculating timing, rhythm, and precision in a sport that had long thrived on brute force. He was, in every sense, a quarterback who thought like a coach. When the Baltimore Colts signed him in 1956, it was more desperation than faith. The team had no established identity, no culture of winning, and little to lose. The Colts were a small market team in a league dominated by the glamour of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Yet the moment Unitas took the field, something shifted. His first appearance was rakia. Few interceptions, a few boos, but behind the rough edges, his poise was unmistakable. He never seemed hurried. Even when pressured, his movements carried an almost mechanical calm. Baltimore's fans, hardened by years of disappointment, recognized that calm as something real. They saw a man who belonged to their kind of struggle. When Unitas threw his first touchdown to Raymond Berry, a precise, almost surgical pass down the sideline, The crowd erupted not just in celebration, but in relief. For the first time, they believed the Colts had someone who could think his way through a storm. Unitas's approach to play calling was unlike anything the league had seen. He refused to treat plays as rigid commands. To him, they were frameworks, living ideas that adapted to the defense. In an era when most quarterbacks ran the play exactly as it was called from the sideline, Unitas demanded autonomy. He studied film obsessively, memorizing not only his own routes but the tendencies of defenders, the subtle cues that revealed a blitz or a zone disguise. On game day, he trusted his own judgment more than the playbook. Weeb Ewbank, the Colts coach, was wise enough to let him. Ewbank understood that Unitas's mind worked faster than the sideline could. In that trust, something revolutionary began to form. The modern quarterback as field general, not just executor. The responsibility for innovation shifted from coach to player. Unitas's audibles, his pre-snap reads, and his calm adaptability were the first signs of football evolving from instinct to intellect. Raymond Berry became the perfect counterpart. A quiet, meticulous receiver, Berry shared Unitas's obsession with precision. He was not the fastest or strongest, but his roots were mathematical, his cuts exact to the inch. Together, they built a chemistry founded on preparation. After practice, while most players left the field, Unitas and Berry stayed for hours, running patterns again and again until the connection between them felt automatic. They invented timing routes, where the ball left Unitas's hand before Berry even turned his head. It required total trust, total calculation, and total control. That partnership reflected something greater than two players in sync. It embodied the emerging idea that football could be engineered. Every movement could be measured, studied, perfected. What once depended on instinct could now be planned. Unitas's leadership transformed the Colts offense into a system, one that could outthink opponents instead of simply outmuscling them. Baltimore, as a city, embraced that intellectual edge. The fans knew what it meant to fight for recognition, to build success through craft and effort. The city's factories and docks echoed with the same discipline that Unitas brought to the field. His black high-top cleats, worn long after other players switched to modern gear, became a symbol of defiance. He looked like a man who worked for a living, not a star who demanded attention. The city loved him for that, and in return, he gave them an identity. By 1957, the Colts began to show flashes of brilliance. Unitas's command of the offense grew sharper, his confidence more deliberate. He called plays not by instinct, but by observation. He adjusted routes based on coverage, a rare act at the time. He moved defenders with his eyes, manipulated safeties with subtle fakes, and treated the game like a chessboard. Opposing coaches began to take notice. Players spoke of his composure in the pocket as something unnatural, as if he saw the field in slow motion. But even brilliance met resistance. Many traditional coaches believed Unitas's independence was reckless. They argued that too much thinking at the line slowed the game. Football, they insisted, was about execution, not intellect. Unitas ignored them. His quiet demeanor masked a relentless belief that he could outthink anyone across from him. His transformation of play calling was not born from rebellion, but from necessity. The Colts' offensive line was not always dominant, and their playbook lacked the complexity of established powerhouses like the Giants. To survive, Unitas needed to improvise. But unlike the improvisation of earlier eras, his version was controlled, deliberate. He created structure within chaos. Every adjustment, every audible, was part of a larger system of cause and effect. Behind every great player lies a moment when instinct becomes philosophy. For Unitas, that moment came in a regular season game against the San Francisco 49ers. The Colts trailed late, the defense pressing tight. On third down, Unitas saw a cornerback leaning inside. He changed the play at the line, signaling to Berry with nothing more than a glance. The snap came. Berry cut outside, and the pass found his hands perfectly in stride. touchdown, that single play was not just a score, was a statement. The quarterback could now control the game not with muscle, but with mind. In the locker room afterward, Weeb Ewbank said little, but he knew what he had witnessed. Football would never again belong solely to coaches on the sideline. It now lived in the eyes and mind of the man behind center. As Unitas rose, so did Baltimore. The city's faith in him turned the Colts into more than a team. They became a symbol of modern football's future. Each victory carried a sense of vindication, proof that intelligence could triumph over power. And with each passing week, the league began to evolve, slowly realizing that strategy could be built not from instinct, but from intellect. By the time the 1958 season arrived, Unitas had become more than a quarterback. He was the embodiment of a new kind of thinking, a player who turned chaos into calculation. His audibles redefined control, his timing redefined precision, and his confidence redefined leadership. Baltimore had found its hero, and football had found its future. Still, destiny required a stage a night when all of Unitas' ideas, all of his calculations, would be tested under the nation's gaze. That night would come at Yankee Stadium in what would soon be called the greatest game ever played. For most of football's early life, instinct was sacred. The coach's gut feeling and the quarterback's intuition were treated as divine. Games were decided in the heat of the moment by the eyes and nerves of men who trusted their senses more than their notes. But as the 1950s turned colder, a quieter revolution began to stir beneath the heavy breath of winter games. It came from a man who did not shout or rage. His genius was measured, deliberate, almost invisible. His name was Weeb Ewbank, and he believed football could be understood, predicted, and controlled through preparation. Ewbank was not the archetype of a football general. He was small, calm, and soft-spoken. Yet he carried in him a mind built for order. Born in Richmond, Indiana, he had been raised in a world that valued humility and method over spectacle. When he entered the professional ranks, he brought with him a belief that success was not born of luck or talent alone. It came from planning. He had learned under Paul Brown in Cleveland, the man who first treated football like a science. Brown's organization, his discipline, and his obsession with detail had already reshaped the sport. Ewbank absorbed that philosophy completely, but he softened it, made it personal, and turned it into something players could live with rather than fear. By the time Ewbank took over in Baltimore, the NFL was moving into a new era. Crowds were growing, television was spreading, and expectations were rising. The game was faster, colder, and far more complex. Ewbank saw what others did not. He understood that as players grew stronger and strategies more intricate, instinct would no longer be enough. The mind would have to replace the gut. He began to build a system that treated every game as a puzzle to be solved through evidence and logic. His offices were quiet sanctuaries of thought. Film reels clicked and whirred while assistants scribbled notes. Every opponent was charted, every formation cataloged. Ewbank's walls were lined with binders that detailed not only his team's plays, but their opponents' habits. He wanted to know which defensive end leaned forward before a blitz, which safety took a false step on play action, which quarterback favored a certain receiver on 3rd and long. He was turning football into pattern recognition. His players followed his example. Practices became classrooms. Sessions that once focused on repetition now demanded comprehension. The Colts were no longer reacting to plays. They were anticipating them. And at the heart of it all was Johnny Unitas, the quarterback whose quiet intensity matched his coach's temperament. Unitas was no natural celebrity. He was a student of the game, a craftsman rather than an artist. Under Ewbank, he became the embodiment of preparation. Together, they forged a partnership built on discipline and trust. When the 1958 NFL championship arrived, few realized they were watching the future unfold. In Yankee Stadium's freezing air, the Baltimore Colts faced the New York Giants in what would become known as the greatest game ever played. The broadcast reached millions, and for the first time, the world saw how precision could look like destiny. The Colts' victory in sudden death overtime was not luck. It was the physical manifestation of preparation. Every drive, every route, every adjustment had been rehearsed in Ewbank's methodical way. When chaos came, his team did not panic. They executed. That night changed the NFL forever. It was the moment when planning overtook instinct as the engine of greatness. Ewbank's calm leadership stood in quiet contrast to the fiery style that would later make Vince Lombardi a household name. Ewbank did not shout or threaten. He reasoned. His players often said he made them feel intelligent, as if they were part of a grand design rather than tools in someone else's plan. His control came from clarity, not fear. When he later took over the New York Jets, his philosophy was tested again. The American Football League was young, chaotic, and loud. It was a place where improvisation reigned, where swagger replaced structure. Ewbank brought order to it. He arrived with his binders, his film, and his steady tone. At first, players thought him too quiet, too slow, but in time, they understood. He was giving them something more powerful than inspiration. He was giving them certainty. In 1969, the result of that certainty stunned the world. His Jets defeated the Baltimore Colts, the team he had built in Super Bowl III. Joe Namath's bold guarantee became legend, but it was Ewbank's system that made it possible. Beneath the showmanship and bravado was the same steady rhythm that had once carried Unitas. The game was won long before it began, in the quiet of the film room, in the repetition of small details that others ignored. Ewbank had bridged to eras. He had coached both the most methodical quarterback of the old guard and the most confident star of the new. He proved that structure and freedom could coexist. What made Ewbank's genius so durable was his understanding of balance. He knew that preparation was not meant to strangle creativity, but to support it. He gave players the mental framework to make decisions without fear. Every man knew his assignment and every contingency. But when the game broke open and instincts were required, those instincts were sharper because they were informed by knowledge. Behind his modest presence was a relentless attention to precision. Ewbank documented everything. His notebooks detailed down and distance tendencies, substitution patterns, and weather adjustments. He thought about how cold air changed ball trajectory and how mud altered timing. He was building football into a science long before computers or analytics entered the conversation. His players might not have realized it at the time, but they were living through the first great data revolution in sports. Even the way he used technology hinted at the future. His staff spliced and rewound film to analyze the smallest details. They tracked results on index cards, building crude databases of tendencies. It was laborious and slow, but Ewbank believed knowledge was worth the effort. He saw the field not as chaos, but as an equation. Every motion had a counter. Every defense could be broken by information. Cold weather became a kind of proving ground for his ideas. When snow fell and the wind cut through the stadium, when muscles stiffened and breath turned white, the teams that had prepared survived. Ewbank made sure his players were ready for that world. They practiced with frozen footballs and rehearsed under miserable conditions. His logic was simple. Adversity reveals who has done their work. What Ewbank accomplished went beyond victories. He changed the way the sport thought about itself. He shifted the culture from improvisation to preparation, from emotion to evidence. He taught a generation of players that football could be learned the way a craft is learned, through patience and study. That legacy became the foundation of the modern NFL, where film sessions, analytics, and mental preparation are as crucial as weight training. In the grand story of football, Ewbank is often a quiet figure in the background of louder legends, yet his fingerprints are everywhere. The color-coded game plans, the tablet reviews on the sidelines, the endless hours of tape study, all trace back to the world he built. He did not seek credit. He saw perfection through understanding. decay, and in doing so, he gave the game its modern intelligence. Ewbank proved that calm could be stronger than fire. He showed that knowledge could be a form of courage. While others chased inspiration, he trusted comprehension. His players did not go into battle hoping for greatness. They entered knowing what to do. That knowledge, that structure, became the unseen force that carried teams through pressure and cold. The blueprints were drawn in those years when the league was still learning to think. The cold air of those stadiums was filled with more than breath and sound. It was filled with a new kind of confidence, born from preparation. Weeb Ewbank's quiet revolution replaced the myth of the gut feeling with the power of the studied mind. He had turned football into something greater than chance, something closer to art through science. And from those blueprints, the next evolution of coaching would rise, transforming the sidelines into laboratories of precision and the game itself into a living map of thought. The winter air inside Yankee Stadium on December 28, 1958, felt electric in a way no one could yet explain. It was more than a championship game. It was the collision point between two eras, the moment when football stopped being chaos and became calculation. On one sideline stood Tom Landry, a man whose mind worked like a chess engine, cold, patient, precise. Across from him was Johnny Unitas, the living embodiment of instinct guided by discipline. Between them stretched the frozen field that would host one of the most cerebral battles the sport had ever known. The crowd of over 60,000 came expecting grit and spectacle. They got something else. They witnessed a silent duel that unfolded not in shouts but in adjustments, not in emotion but in intellect. Landry's New York Giants defense was an evolving machine, one that sought to outthink rather than overpower. He had introduced a 4-2-3 defense, a structure that gave him flexibility to disguise coverages and manipulate space. To most of the league, it was still a novelty. To Landry, it was a philosophy. He believed defense could dictate rhythm, that it could shape an opponent's mind as much as its playbook. Landry had studied Unitas all season. He knew the quarterback's patience, his composure, his love of patterns. So he built his defense like a maze, a sequence of shifting looks designed to test Unitas's ability to adapt. He instructed his linebackers to hover between run and pass responsibilities, freezing Unitas for just a heartbeat before every throw. His safeties rotated in complex movements that disguised blitzes as coverage and coverage as blitzes. Each snap became a problem Unitas had to solve in real time. Unitas, however, was not a man to be cornered. His genius was not raw athleticism, but awareness. He treated the line of scrimmage like a study desk, reading, adjusting, rewriting the play seconds before it began. His audibles were quiet sentences of logic spoken in code. He would step up, glance at Barry, glance at his backs, and then shift the formation by inches. Each motion was a question posed to Landry's defense. Every completed pass was an answer. The game unfolded as a dialogue between two minds. Landry would disguise a blitz with an overload look, forcing Unitas to shift protection. Unitas would then audible into a quick release, neutralizing the rush. Landry would adjust his linebackers, closing the middle of the field, and Unitas would exploit the edges. It was strategy evolving in real time, each man anticipating not the next move, but the next three. This was not the brand of football America had known. For decades, the game had been defined by brute force and emotional momentum. Now, it was being transformed into a contest of intellect. The fans did not see all of it. They saw the completions, the tackles, the fumbles. But underneath the noise, something deeper was happening. Coaches were calling chess openings. Quarterbacks were reading defenses like code breakers. Every yard was earned through thought as much as strength. Tom Landry stood on the sideline with arms folded, his expression unreadable. He rarely shouted, rarely gestured. His mind worked faster than his voice could keep up. He kept notebooks filled with formations and counterformations, pages of diagrams that looked more like mathematics than sport. To him, Football was geometry. The field was a plane, the players were points, and victory was achieved by controlling space and angles. Against Unitas, he had found his perfect opponent, a man capable of solving those geometric puzzles in motion. Unitas, meanwhile, remained unshaken in the pocket. Even when the rush came hard, his movements were small and deliberate. He slid to his left, waited an extra second, then released the ball at the last possible moment. His passes to Raymond Berry looked effortless, but every one was the product of calculation. Berry would run precise routes, often breaking them by inches depending on how the defender's shoulders turned. They communicated through glances, through instinct, honed by hours of preparation. It was not improvisation, it was structure expressed as art. In the third quarter, Landry's defense seemed to have found rhythm. They contained the Colts' running game and began forcing Unitas into long yardage situations. The Giants' defensive line crowded the middle, while the linebackers floated back to disrupt passing lanes. For a time, it worked. Unitas threw into tight coverage and missed open men. The field seemed smaller, the windows tighter. But Landry knew too well that great quarterbacks feed on constraint. He had given Unitas a puzzle, and Unitas began to solve it. On one crucial drive, Unitas started changing plays at the line more aggressively. He used quick counts, forcing Landry's defense to reveal its disguise early. He sent his halfback in motion to test whether the coverage was man or zone. Slowly, he dismantled the disguise that had been built to stop him. Landry's brilliance met Unitas's patience, and the tension between them became the pulse of the game. By the fourth quarter, the duel had elevated the entire sport. Each side was adjusting to the other's logic, not merely its tactics. The Giants' defense tightened every zone, trying to close off Berry's routes. The Colts countered by using timing patterns that broke before defenders could react. It was football, learning how to think. Every sequence revealed a new layer of strategy. When the game reached overtime, the air had turned sharp and heavy. The players' bodies were exhausted, but their minds remained locked in the duel. On that final drive, Unitas orchestrated football's first true symphony of situational mastery. Every audible, every timeout, every pass was chosen with perfect reasoning. He led his team downfield with the cold precision of a man who understood that victory was no longer about courage alone. It was about clarity under pressure. Landry's defenders fought with everything they had, yet they too seemed to recognize the shift. They were not simply reacting to plays. They were part of a larger thought process. Each adjustment from the sideline came with purpose, each alignment part of an evolving strategy. Football had finally joined the realm of intellect. When Alan Amici crossed the goal line in sudden death, the Colts erupted. The crowd roared, and television cameras captured the moment that would forever define the league. But beneath the celebration, beneath the noise and joy, something profound had happened. The game had become self-aware. The duel between Unitas and Landry had transformed football from reaction to anticipation, from force to foresight. That night, the league realized that genius could live on both sides of the ball. Landry had proven that defense could think as deeply as offense, that schemes could match improvisation with calculation. Unitas had shown that intelligence could exist under pressure, that a quarterback's mind could control the rhythm of chaos. Together, they gave football its intellectual identity. In the days that followed, coaches across the league began studying the film of that game, not for its highlights, but for its thought. They saw how Unitas read the field, how Landry disguised his fronts, how both men forced the other into adaptation. The game's future was born in those exchanges. It was no longer enough to be faster or stronger. Teams would have to be smarter. Yankee Stadium had witnessed more than a championship. It had seen the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one fought not in muscle but in mind. The field had become a chessboard, and from that day forward, every coach, every quarterback, and every defender would have to think in moves and counter-moves. The silence after the final whistle carried a strange awareness. a sense that everyone who had watched understood something irreversible had taken place. Football would never again be a simple game of heart and collision. It had learned to calculate, to anticipate, to evolve. And the minds of Landry and Unitas had shown it the way. When the Baltimore Colts and New York Giants walked onto the field on December 28, 1958, they were not just playing for a championship. They were unknowingly performing for the future. More than 40 million Americans tuned in to the live broadcast, a staggering number for its time. Many of them had never seen a professional football game before. The cameras at Yankee Stadium did more than record a contest. They turned football into a national story, a ritual that could now live in every living room. Before that night, football was a regional fascination. Baseball was the true national pastime, the sport that ruled headlines and radio waves. College football had prestige, but professional football existed in scattered markets with loyal yet local followings. The 1958 championship changed that hierarchy forever. It was the first time the drama of football unfolded on live national television with perfect narrative symmetry. A tight score, a frozen field, a sudden death finish. It looked cinematic, even before anyone thought of it that way. Television brought clarity to the chaos of the sport. Viewers who might have once been intimidated by football's complexity began to see it as rhythm and pattern. The black and white images framed the game with intimacy. The sweat, the exhaustion, the determination etched on every player's face gave the sport a human pulse. For the first time, America could see the strategy unfold. Coaches pacing the sideline. Quarterbacks reading defenses. Linemen crouched in formation like soldiers awaiting command. It was not merely athletic competition, it was story. NBC's broadcast team, led by announcers Chris Schenkel and Chuck Thompson, guided millions of viewers through every tense minute. Their commentary shaped how people understood football's new language of thought. Kay described formations, pointed out adjustments, and narrated the decisions of Unitas and Landry with awe. The nation was watching a chess match in real time, but one played with helmets and collisions. What made that night revolutionary was not only that people were watching, but that they felt connected. Television collapsed distance. A family in Iowa could watch Johnny Unitas orchestrate a drive as if sitting in the stands. A factory worker in Ohio could witness Alan Amici's winning touchdown and feel part of a shared triumph. Football became communal. The broadcast gave it a stage that no stadium could contain. Behind the scenes, the National Football League understood what had happened. Commissioner Bert Bell, who had fought for television exposure, realized that the medium had just changed everything. For years, the league had worried that broadcasting games might hurt attendance. After 1958, that fear evaporated. The ratings proved that television was not a threat, but a bridge. The game's visual storytelling was too powerful to ignore. Television did not just amplify the sport, it transformed the way it was played. Coaches began designing plays with the camera in mind, emphasizing spacing, timing, and precision that would translate through the lens. The drama of the 2-minute drill, popularized by Unitas in that very game, became a television spectacle. Viewers leaned forward during those final drives, learning the rhythm of clock management, field position, and decision-making. The field had become a theater of tension, and every snap, a potential climax. The exposure also shifted how players viewed themselves. They were no longer anonymous laborers in helmets. They were faces recognized by millions. Johnny Unitas, once a steelworker cut by the Pittsburgh Steelers, became a household name overnight. Raymond Berry, whose disciplined roots were studied by aspiring receivers, became a symbol of precision. Even coaches like Weeb Ewbank and Tom Landry found themselves in the national spotlight. Their stoic expressions and tactical mastery gave football a new kind of authority. As the sport entered the 1960s, the partnership between football and television deepened. Networks realized that football structure fit perfectly into broadcast programming. The breaks between plays allowed for commentary, analysis, and advertising. The game moved in segments, like acts in a play. Each possession carried its own story arc. Television executives saw in football the ideal medium for suspense and narrative rhythm. The NFL quickly learned how to harness that potential. The league negotiated television contracts that turned teams into national brands. The Green Bay Packers, Dallas Cowboys, and Baltimore Colts became familiar even to those who lived hundreds of miles away. Fans began choosing allegiance, not by geography, but by style, personality, and story. Television had democratized fandom. What made football thrive on screen was its balance between intellect and violence. The collisions drew attention, but it was the thinking that held it. Viewers learned to appreciate the chess match beneath the hits. The 1958 broadcast taught them that every play was a question answered by strategy. Audiences began to listen for the cadence of audibles, to notice the subtle shifts in defensive alignment, to predict outcomes alongside the commentators. Watching football became a mental exercise shared by millions. That same exposure elevated the players' discipline. They became role models, public figures whose conduct mattered beyond the field. The camera followed them from the huddle to the locker room. The intimacy of television forced professionalism. Teams tightened organization, refined communication, and began valuing articulate leadership. Johnny Unitas, with his calm presence and clear command, became the prototype for the modern quarterback. Composed, strategic, almost professorial. Television also transformed the fan's memory. Before, moments existed only in recollection and newspaper clippings. Now they lived forever on tape. The winning drive of 1958 could be replayed, analyzed, and mythologized. The ability to record and relive turned football into an evolving narrative. Every Sunday became a chapter in an ongoing story America could follow from week to week. In the years that followed, the networks and the league forged a powerful alliance. CBS secured rights to broadcast NFL games, and soon the presentation itself became part of the identity of the sport. The camera angles improved, slow motion was introduced, and commentary grew more analytical. The seeds of modern sports broadcasting were all planted that night at Yankee Stadium. The 1958 championship had proven that football was not just a game, it was performance. Its structure mirrored drama. There was conflict, momentum, character, and resolution. The sudden death finish gave it the emotional precision of a film's final act. It was the kind of story America wanted to see and feel again, and television would deliver it every week. With the new exposure came money. Advertising revenue soared. Teams began investing in better facilities. Player salaries rose, and the league gained legitimacy as a professional enterprise. The game's intellectual side benefited as well. With more resources came more time for study, for scouting, for planning. The nation that had seen Unitas and Landry battle in the cold wanted more of that intelligence on display. Coaches obliged by building deeper playbooks and designing more complex formations. As the audience grew, so did expectation. Viewers demanded precision, drama, and spectacle. Television forced football to become consistent, professional, and creative. It rewarded teams that played with vision and punished those that remained stagnant. The league began to see itself as a product of entertainment and intellect. Every broadcast was an event, every game a stage for innovation. The 1958 broadcast was more than an introduction. It was a transformation of perception. It showed America that football was not random violence, but structured competition. It revealed the artistry of coaching and the emotional discipline of players. It gave the sport an identity that could survive beyond the field. From that night forward, football no longer belonged to stadium crowds alone. It belonged to a nation that had seen itself in the huddle, felt its suspense through the screen, and learned that brilliance could emerge in the middle of chaos. The partnership between football and television would evolve into one of the most powerful cultural forces in American life. Every modern broadcast, every analysis show, every halftime breakdown traces back to that winter evening in New York. The game that had been regional became universal. The plays that had been instinctive became methodical. And the strategy that once lived only on the field now lived in the minds of millions who watched from their homes, studying, anticipating, and learning. It was not just a game on television. It was America watching itself think. In the closing minutes of regulation, as the cold air of Yankee Stadium pressed down on the crowd, something happened that would redefine football forever. The game between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants had already been a masterpiece of endurance and tension. But what unfolded in the final minutes and into overtime became something else entirely. It was not just a battle of strength or courage. It was the precise moment football learned how to think. Johnny Unitas walked into that huddle not as a quarterback commanding men by instinct, but as a conductor orchestrating a system. He was calm, even as chaos surrounded him. The Giants' defense was built by Tom Landry, the most disciplined strategist the game had seen. Their alignment was mathematical, every movement calculated to close space and pressure the passer. Yet, Unitas saw it differently. He treated their geometry as something to solve, not something to fear. Each play became a response, a correction, a refinement. The famous drive that would lead the Colts to tie and then win the 1958 championship was not improvised brilliance alone. It was the dawning of structure within freedom. Unitas began to see the defense in layers, adjusting protections, timing routes, and manipulating space in real time. Raymond Berry, his most trusted receiver, read those changes instantly. Their connection, honed through thousands of unseen repetitions, turned broken plays into designed ones. On that drive, Berry caught passes that were not drawn in the playbook. They were drawn in the air. The two men communicated through a language no one else fully understood. Unitas would drop back, glance for a fraction of a second, and Berry would shift his route just enough to break free. The rhythm of it all was unprecedented. In an era when quarterbacks called plays largely based on intuition, Unitas's control felt almost mechanical in its precision. Every snap was a decision made within seconds, but built upon hours of study. The use of the 2-minute drill was not new, but Unitas transformed it into something living. He began to manipulate tempo, forcing the defense to react rather than dictate. Each completed pass was not just progress downfield, but psychological momentum. The Giants' legendary linebacker Sam Huff, once confident in the system Landry had built, began to realize that he was no longer reacting to a player, but to an idea. When Unitas hit Berry over the middle for another first down, the shape of modern football began to emerge. The game was becoming about sequencing, data, and rhythm, not just muscle and instinct. Every audible called at the line carried the weight of pattern recognition. Unitas was scanning defensive fronts, not by sight alone, but through memory. He knew which coverage shell they were in. He could feel the linebackers cheating inside. And he knew precisely how long his offensive line could hold before collapsing. The drive moved with an efficiency the sport had never seen. It felt premeditated, as if scripted years before. And yet, it was all spontaneous but structured. The paradox became the future of football. Coaches watching from around the league began to realize that success would no longer depend on who hit hardest, but who thought fastest. Ewbank, and Berry had fused intellect with execution. When the Colts reached field goal range and tied the game, something fundamental had shifted. The very nature of how the sport perceived control changed. Fans felt the tension of every decision. Broadcasters narrated it as if it were a story unfolding in chapters. And for the first time, America watched a game not as random chaos, but as deliberate architecture. The idea that football could be designed moment to moment had been proven live in front of millions. Overtime only deepened the transformation. The Giants' defense adjusted, trying to disguise coverages and confuse reads, but Unitas adapted faster. He slowed the pace when needed, called runs to redirect attention, and returned to quick timing routes to break defensive rhythm. The game became a laboratory of cause and effect. Each snap revealed something new about the relationship between preparation and instinct. The famous pass to Raymond Berry that placed the Colts near the goal line was pure synthesis of human trust and schematic evolution. It represented not only their connection, but also the future of offensive thinking. Unitas used short passes like chess moves, forcing the defense to compress, then threatening deep seams that never came. This constant shifting of perception mirrored what modern offenses would later perfect through spread formations and motion. It all began there, under the lights, in the quiet moments of sudden death football. When Alan Amici finally crossed the goal line to end the game, the crowd erupted in relief and disbelief. It was the first sudden death victory in professional football history. But beyond the celebration, something deeper resonated. The game had transitioned from physical spectacle to cognitive theater. What fans witnessed was not just the triumph of the Colts over the Giants, but the triumph of systematic thought over brute reaction. In the days and years that followed, the drive became the film study template for every young coach and quarterback. It was analyzed, diagrammed, and retold endlessly. They discovered in it the earliest DNA of modern offensive philosophy: spacing, timing, rhythm, and adaptability. Each route combination was a revelation in precision. Each read was a lesson in patience. Football was no longer a game played in bursts of emotion, but a contest of sustained intellect. Unitas's leadership style became the prototype for modern quarterbacks. He was not a fiery motivator, but a silent engineer. He believed that understanding the mechanics of time and space mattered more than shouting in the huddle. His control of the field turned chaos into command. In every modern 2-minute drill, in every no-huddle offense, his influence can be traced. Even the broadcast itself became part of the transformation. Viewers at home, guided by camera angles and commentary, began to see strategy unfold. The drive was not just watched, was interpreted. America was learning to see football as a sequence of decisions, not collisions. Coaches like Vince Lombardi, watching closely, understood that mental discipline could be trained the same way physical endurance was. The next generation of football would be built not on instinct alone, but on structure, order, and analysis. What Unitas did on that December night in 1958 was not simply win a championship. He redefined what leadership meant in the game. His command over that drive introduced the idea that every yard gained could be calculated, that every play could be designed to manipulate an opponent's mind. From that point on, the best teams would not just practice harder, they would think harder. The drive that rewrote offense became the foundational myth of the NFL's modern era. It transformed how coaches approached film, how coordinators planned sequences, and how quarterbacks trained themselves to process chaos. It was no longer about survival. It was about solving. What began as a desperate march downfield in freezing weather became the intellectual awakening of American football. From it, new eras of strategy, analytics, and innovation were born. And through that drive, the game learned that its greatest victories would come not from instinct, but from understanding. In the years after the 1958 championship, the quiet revolution that Johnny Unitas began took on a life of its own. Coaches across the league began to realize that the mind of the quarterback could no longer remain unstructured. The freedom that once defined the position started to be reined in, not out of distrust, but out of the growing obsession with control. The beauty of improvisation, the raw creativity that once lived in the chaos of the huddle, began to fade as sideline authority expanded. Before the late 1950s, quarterbacks were improvisers. They were expected to sense the flow of a game, feel the defense, and respond in the moment. Play calling was done on the field through experience and intuition. There were no headsets, no laminated play sheets, no preordained sequencing. The quarterback was not just the executor of strategy. He was the strategist himself. But once coaches saw what structure could produce, they began to take that autonomy back. The more predictable structure became, the more control could be asserted from the sideline. It began innocently. Coaches like Vince Lombardi and Tom Landry took the innovations of the late 1950s and turned them into doctrine. Lombardi's Green Bay Packers played with unmatched precision, every block and route choreographed to the inch. Landry's Cowboys developed defensive systems that left nothing to instinct. Everything was charted, measured, and reduced to principle. The game grew more sophisticated, but that sophistication came at a cost. The player's voice inside the huddle began to quiet. As offensive playbooks expanded, quarterbacks had less freedom to adjust. What had once been a living dialogue between players became a top-down command system. Coaches studied film with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They sought to eliminate uncertainty, to remove the human error that defined earlier decades. Every play was called with purpose, but that purpose no longer came from the player who executed it. It came from the man with the headset, standing yards away on the sideline. Technology played its role as well. The introduction of radio communication between coaches and quarterbacks in the 1950s was meant to streamline play calling. But it did more than that. It shifted the balance of authority. Quarterbacks no longer had to read the field and decide for themselves. They were told what to do, play after play. The psychological effect was profound. The position that once demanded complete mental ownership of the game became partially dependent on external direction. What Unitas began as a blend of intellect and instinct was being distilled into something purely systematic. The art of reacting in the moment, of seeing something unplanned and exploiting it, began to disappear. Football was turning into a science. Coaches spoke of execution as the ultimate goal, but execution implied obedience. The very spontaneity that had made the sport unpredictable and human was being replaced by calculation. Still, there were those who resisted. Quarterbacks like Bart Starr, Len Dawson, and later Joe Namath carried pieces of that older spirit. They improvised when the play broke down. They read defenses not just through film, but through instinctive awareness. Yet even they operated within increasingly rigid frameworks. Coaches wanted to design perfection. Players wanted to feel the game. The tension between those two forces became one of the defining struggles of modern football. The shift toward control did produce results. Teams that mastered structure dominated the 1960s. Lombardi's Packers, disciplined to near-military precision, won 5 championships in 7 years. Their success reinforced the belief that control equaled victory. The image of Bart Starr driving the Packers downfield in frigid Lambeau was hailed as heroism, but behind it lay a carefully scripted system where every motion was calculated. The huddle no longer breathed with freedom, it recited the lines of a plan. By the 1970s, this transformation became institutionalized. Coaching trees formed across the league, each branch teaching its disciples how to master control. The West Coast offense under Bill Walsh was a masterpiece of design. It was elegant, mathematical, and effective. But within that precision lay the quiet burial of spontaneity. Coup d'etat. The quarterback became an instrument of timing. Every throw had a designed window, every receiver a fixed progression. Improvisation still existed, but it was now the exception, not the soul of the game. Film study, once a tool for understanding, became a mandate. Players spent hours dissecting opponents' tendencies, memorizing patterns rather than feeling the rhythm of the field. Coaches developed extensive scouting reports and situation charts that dictated play selection by down and distance. The sideline began to resemble a command center. The game had evolved from reaction to orchestration. The quarterback's voice became a channel for strategy, not a source of it. Even the audience began to change. As television brought more games into homes, the complexity of play calling became part of the spectacle. Analysts explained the science behind motion, coverage, and alignment. Fans began to see football not as a contest of wills, but as an unfolding of blueprints. The romance of unpredictability, that feeling that anything could happen, was slowly replaced by admiration for flawless design. Yet something was lost in that perfection. The players of the earlier generation had carried an elemental pride in feeling the game's pulse. They believed that football was alive, that it breathed and shifted in ways that could not be entirely planned. When the game moved towards systemization, it risked losing that heartbeat. The quarterback, who once embodied creative defiance, became a symbol of obedience to the machine. Johnny Unitas himself felt that shift. In later interviews, he often spoke about how the game had changed. He believed that quarterbacks were becoming too dependent on coaches. He lamented the loss of autonomy that once made the position unique. To him, the quarterback was supposed to be the field general, not the messenger. But by the late 1970s, even Unitas's own legacy had been absorbed into a structure that left little room for improvisation. The evolution he helped inspire had, in a way, turned against the very instincts that made it possible. The sideline's expanding influence was not malicious. It was a natural outcome of progress. Every innovation brought with it a tighter web of control. Coaches believed they were refining the game, making it smarter, safer, more predictable. And in many ways, they were right. But predictability is the enemy of imagination. What once made football thrilling was not just its violence or speed, but its uncertainty. The moments when instinct defied logic and players created something impossible from chaos. By the 1980s, headsets, film breakdowns, and scripting had become the norm. The quarterback was the executor of a plan, not the author of it. Even the pre-snap audibles that Unitas had pioneered became conditional, restricted within a coach's approval. Freedom existed only within boundaries. Football had grown up, but in its maturity, it had also lost a piece of its soul. The death of spontaneity was not the death of beauty. The game still produced art, but it was art by design, not by instinct. The field had become a chessboard where every move was anticipated. And while fans and coaches marveled at the precision, old players could not help but feel a sense of longing, a nostalgia for a time when the game was less perfect, but more alive. Football had learned to think for itself. A team doing so, it had begun to forget how to feel. There is a moment in football history when discipline became a kind of religion. That moment found its purest expression in Green Bay, Wisconsin, under the guidance of Vince Lombardi. What began in Baltimore as a revolution of thought reached its next evolution in the cold discipline of Lombardi's Packers. Every motion, every block, every step became part of a larger structure that defined not only a team, but an entire era of football. The game had begun to think for itself in 1958. By the mid-1960s, under Lombardi, it began to plan its thoughts with precision. Lombardi arrived in Green Bay in 1959, inheriting a franchise that had forgotten how to win. The Packers had been reduced to an afterthought in a small town that once called itself Titletown. But Lombardi saw more than players. He saw clay that could be shaped into an ideal. His methods were not born from creativity, but from order. He believed that football could be perfected through repetition, and that execution could replace improvisation. He demanded absolute adherence to the system. To play for Lombardi was to surrender to structure. The power sweep became the symbol of that structure. To the untrained eye, it looked simple. A handoff to pulling guards and a halfback sweeping around the end. But within that simplicity lived a universe of precision. Every lineman had a target, every movement a rhythm. Lombardi would run the same play hundreds of times in practice until it became instinct. He believed that perfection was not found in complexity, but in flawless repetition. The Packers did not beat opponents with surprise. They beat them with certainty. Everyone in the stadium knew the power sweep was coming, yet few could stop it. Lombardi's genius was not invention, but refinement. He distilled the chaos of football into a formula. He demanded complete faith in the system because he believed that trust was the foundation of success. His players did not question plays. They executed them with conviction. To him, discipline was freedom. Freedom from error, from uncertainty, from failure. The Packers practiced until movement became memory, and memory became identity. In the locker room, Lombardi spoke of football as a moral pursuit. He told his players that the pursuit of excellence was a duty. His words were not about tactics, but about character. He believed that willpower could overcome talent, that structure could overcome improvisation. Players like Jerry Kramer, Jim Taylor, and Paul Hornung became extensions of his mind on the field. They embodied his belief that football was not a game of chance, but a test of order against chaos. Lombardi's practices were legendary for their intensity. Mistakes were not tolerated, not because of anger, but because of philosophy. To him, imperfection was a sign of indiscipline. Every play had to be executed with the same rhythm, the same precision, until it transcended thought. When the Packers stepped onto the field, they moved like one organism. The power sweep was not a play. It was a manifestation of unity. Under this structure, Green Bay dominated the 1960s. 5 championships in 7 years, including the first 2 Super Bowls, turned the Packers into a symbol of excellence. But beneath the triumphs lay a quiet shift in the psychology of football. Lombardi had transformed the game from a collection of instincts into an institution of execution. The freedom that once belonged to the quarterback or the running back now belonged to the playbook. The huddle became a place of obedience. The beauty of unpredictability gave way to the beauty of control. Opponents spoke of the Packers as if they were a machine. They were not the most athletic team, nor the most creative, but they were unbreakable. Every player knew his role. Every assignment was precise. This philosophy began to influence every level of the sport. Coaches across the league studied Lombardi's methods, not for his plays, but for his structure. Football became a game of systems. Preparation, not instinct, determined victory. The Lombardi structure extended beyond tactics. It reshaped leadership itself. The coach was no longer a motivator standing on the sidelines, but the architect of every moment. Lombardi demanded respect, not through fear, but through consistency. He held himself to the same standard he demanded of his players. His voice carried authority because it carried conviction. He did not seek to control his players' minds. He sought to align them with a vision that transcended the game. Even in victory, there was a cost. The pressure to maintain perfection weighed heavily. Players spoke of exhaustion, of the relentless pursuit that allowed no room for error. Yet they also spoke of pride, of being part of something larger than themselves. Lombardi's system did not just win games. It built character. It demanded selflessness. To deviate from the plan was to betray the team. In the broader arc of football history, the Lombardi structure marked the formal end of the sport's instinctual age. Creativity was no longer the foundation. Discipline was. The power sweep symbolized the triumph of design over improvisation. The chaos that had defined the early decades of the NFL was being replaced by organization. Coaches began to view football less as a contest of athletes and more as a competition of preparation. This new mindset influenced every aspect of the game. Film study intensified. Practices became laboratories of precision. The vocabulary of football changed. Words like execution, system, and structure replaced gut, instinct, and feel. The game was becoming industrialized, built on repetition and efficiency. And while fans admired the perfection, something intangible had shifted beneath the surface. Lombardi himself understood this paradox. He often said that football was a reflection of life, that it mirrored the struggle for excellence. Yet even he recognized that perfection was impossible. The pursuit of it, however, gave purpose. His Packers were not just a team. They were a philosophy in motion. When Lombardi spoke to his players about the power sweep, he was not teaching them a play. He was teaching them discipline, humility, and persistence. His structure became the blueprint for modern coaching. Every coach who came after borrowed something from him. Bill Walsh borrowed precision. Bill Belichick borrowed discipline. Nick Saban borrowed control. The structure that began with Lombardi's Packers became the unspoken foundation of American football. It was a model that rewarded preparation and punished improvisation. It was the natural evolution of the game's search for order. But there was an irony in that evolution. Lombardi's pursuit of perfection was rooted in faith, faith that repetition could create greatness. Yet in codifying that process, football risked losing its spontaneity. The same structure that created dominance also limited creativity. Players who once thrived on instinct now thrived on execution. Coaches became conductors and players became instruments. The symphony was perfect, but the improvisation that once defined the sport was fading. The legacy of the Lombardi structure still shapes football today. The obsession with play design, with precision timing, with errorless execution, can be traced back to those frozen fields in green. Lombardi taught football how to think systematically, how to control chaos, but he also taught it that the cost of control is the surrender of freedom. In the quiet of winter practices, as the Packers ran the same play again and again under a gray Wisconsin sky, they were not just mastering football, they were redefining it. The Lombardi structure was not a playbook. 'Twas a philosophy that turned a violent, unpredictable sport into an art of precision. 'Twas the moment when football stopped being wild and became deliberate. When instinct gave way to order, and when the pursuit of perfection became the game's true religion. The evolution of quarterbacking after the 1958 championship can be traced through a single unbroken lineage of thought. Johnny Unitas gave the position its mind. Roger Staubach gave it its discipline. Between those two figures lies one of the most important transformations in the history of football: the transition from instinctive improvisation to intellectual mastery. The quarterback was no longer just a competitor. He became the embodiment of preparation, the living expression of an organized game. When Unitas led Baltimore to victory in that winter of 1958, he introduced the idea that a quarterback could think like a coach. His control over the game was mental as much as physical. He studied opponents with an obsessive eye, noting patterns and vulnerabilities that others missed. Every decision he made on the field felt instinctive, but behind that instinct was preparation. He carried his understanding of defenses in his head, adjusting plays based on coverage and alignment. In a league where chaos once dictated outcomes, Unitas began to impose reason. In the years that followed, that reason became the expectation. Coaches looked for quarterbacks who could process information, who could manage the field like generals. The position became a test of intellect as much as arm strength. Quarterbacks were judged by their ability to absorb systems, to execute structure with precision. As the league entered the 1960s, a new generation of passers emerged who understood that football was now as much about study as it was about courage. Roger Staubach represented the next phase of that evolution. His story was different from Unitas's. Where Unitas had risen from rejection and grit, Staubach came through order and discipline. A graduate of the United States Naval Academy, Staubach brought a soldier's mindset to the game. His sense of responsibility, preparation, and calm under pressure became his defining traits. In Staubach, the position of quarterback found its most complete fusion of intellect and control. He was both student and commander, analytical and fearless. Staubach entered the NFL at a time when coaching systems were reaching new levels of sophistication. Tom Landry, the architect of the Dallas Cowboys, designed his offense around precision and preparation. Landry viewed football as geometry in motion. Every route had a purpose, every progression a logic. For Staubach, this environment was both a challenge and a revelation. He learned that mastery was not in defiance of structure, but in perfecting it. His genius was not improvisation for its own sake, but improvisation born from understanding every possible outcome. The partnership between Staubach and Landry symbolized a new era in football. It was the marriage of intellect and system, of human instinct guided by methodical design. Landry gave Staubach a framework. Staubach gave it life. On the field, he was calm but relentless. He studied film for hours, internalizing every defensive pattern. Yet when the play broke down, he could still create, not through chance, but through comprehension. His improvisation was no longer chaos. It was informed spontaneity. This balance between discipline and intuition defined the quarterback position for decades to come. The freedom that Unitas once fought to preserve within structure found a new expression through quarterbacks like Staubach, who learned to thrive inside systems without being confined by them. Football had become too complex for instinct alone, but it still required players who could feel the rhythm of the game. Staubach represented that rare equilibrium. The transformation from Unitas to Staubach was also a reflection of broader cultural change. The 1950s had been an era of individuality in sports. Heroes were defined by will and defiance. By the 1970s, teamwork and discipline had become the ideal. America itself had changed. The nation that once celebrated rebellion now valued order and preparation. Football mirrored that shift. Coaches built systems that demanded cooperation. Players who succeeded were those who understood not only their roles, but the logic behind them. The mental demands of the position grew heavier with each passing year. Quarterbacks were expected to memorize playbooks that read like encyclopedias. They studied defensive alignments until recognition became reflex. Preparation became identity. To be a great quarterback meant to live inside the game, to think it constantly. The field became a chessboard, and the quarterback its grandmaster. Unitas laid the groundwork, but Staubach refined the blueprint. He demonstrated that intellect and preparation were not separate from courage. They were its foundation. His leadership was not based on volume, but on clarity. His teammates trusted him because they knew he understood everything happening around him. He embodied the principle that control and composure could coexist with creativity. The legacy of this transformation extended beyond individual players. It redefined how coaches built teams and how organizations evaluated talent. Scouting shifted its focus. Quarterbacks were no longer judged only by arm strength or athleticism, but by mental acuity. Teams sought players who could learn systems quickly, process information under pressure, and remain composed amid chaos. The psychological demands of the position increased, and with them came the pressure of expectation. Staubach's influence also changed how offenses were structured. The quarterback became the interpreter of the coach's vision. Offensive coordinators developed more complex play designs, trusting that quarterbacks could handle the cognitive load. The line between coach and player began to blur. The quarterback was now a conduit, translating theory into action. His preparation determined the team's rhythm. His understanding of timing and spacing dictated the pace of the game. Even off the field, the image of the quarterback evolved. He became the intellectual face of the franchise, the thinker, the planner, the embodiment of precision. The era of brute strength was fading. In its place rose an era where mental sharpness defined greatness. Fans saw in quarterbacks like Staubach the reflection of modern leadership, thoughtful, composed, and accountable. Yet with all the progress came a new kind of pressure. The expectation to know everything, to anticipate everything, could be suffocating. The quarterback's mistakes were no longer viewed as miscalculations in the moment, but failures in preparation. Every interception became a question of study. Every miss read a flaw in understanding. The mental burden became immense. The very intelligence that elevated the position also made it isolating. Still, there was poetry in the way these men carried that burden. Unitas with his blue-collar toughness, and Staubach with his disciplined grace, represented two sides of the same evolution. They proved that intelligence could define physical performance, that the mind was as important as the body in determining victory. The transition between them marked the full arrival of modern football, a game where thought guided every movement. By the time Staubach retired in 1979, the transformation was complete. The quarterback had become the central intelligence of the sport. The freedom to improvise still existed, but it was now informed by preparation, not impulse. The lineage from Unitas to Staubach was the story of football growing up, of a game learning how to think clearly. And yet, within that evolution, lingered an unspoken question. If preparation became identity, what happened to instinct? If control defined success, what was left of the unpredictability that once made football so human? Those questions would echo into the next era, as the game continued to evolve under new systems, new minds, and new philosophies. The quarterback had become the brain of the operation, but the heart of football was still searching for balance between reason and emotion, between preparation and passion. The story of Unitas to Staubach was not just about two men. It was about the game itself, the ongoing struggle between the intellect that seeks control and the spirit that seeks freedom. By the late 1960s, the figure of the coach in the National Football League had begun to resemble something closer to a mathematician than a motivator. Nowhere was that transformation clearer than in the presence of Tom Landry. What began with his quiet innovations as the New York Giants defensive coordinator in the 1958 championship evolved into a complete redefinition of what it meant to control a football game. When he took the helm of the expansion Dallas Cowboys in 1960, Landry was not merely trying to build a winning team. He was trying to build an entire philosophy of controlled, repeatable execution. He believed that football could be understood through order. That belief made him one of the first true system coaches in the sport's history. Landry's Cowboys were not guided by fiery speeches or impulsive emotion. They were guided by design. Every motion, every route, every blocking angle existed for a reason that could be explained and diagrammed. He treated football as a closed loop of input and output, where human decision could be analyzed and optimized. His players were expected to absorb information like engineers studying the performance of a machine. This was a radical shift from the instinct-driven world of the pre-1958 era. Football had begun to think for itself, and Landry was the man translating that thought into structure. He created what he called the flex defense, a system that revolutionized the way teams read and responded to offensive motion. Instead of traditional alignment, Landry positioned his linemen a half step off the line of scrimmage. This gave them the ability to react, not merely to charge forward blindly. It was a defense based on observation, on discipline, on refusing to be drawn out of position by instinct. That same mindset extended across the entire Cowboys organization. Players were no longer improvisers on a stage. They were instruments in an orchestration of precision. The results came slowly but unmistakably. The Cowboys suffered through losing seasons as Landry refined his system, often facing criticism that his methods were too rigid, too cerebral for the raw violence of the sport. Yet Landry never deviated. He believed that mastery came not from emotion, but from repetition. His practices were organized like scientific experiments, each designed to test the limits of timing and coordination. In doing so, he transformed preparation into a culture of constant improvement. When quarterback Don Meredith first tried to operate within Landry's structured offense, he found the burden overwhelming. The playbook read more like a technical manual than a series of football calls. Every formation connected to a family of reads, and every read required a decision tree based on defensive reaction. It was the logical continuation of what Unitas had begun in 1958 football as applied cognition. Meredith resisted at first, chafing under Landry's relentless control. But with time, and with the evolution of the roster, the Cowboys learned to thrive inside that structure. By the early 1970s, Landry's system had produced results that could no longer be denied. The Cowboys became a model of consistency, appearing in multiple NFC championships and winning 2 Super Bowls. Their success was not dependent on one transcendent athlete or moment of improvisation. It was the product of a framework that could be repeated year after year. The team could change quarterbacks, receivers, and linemen, and the system would still function. That repeatability was Landry's genius. He had created something more permanent than victory. He had created a method. Landry's relationship with his players was famously distant. He wore his trademark fedora on the sidelines and rarely displayed emotion, but within his stillness was an intensity that few could match. He studied film as if decoding enemy communications. He designed plays as if balancing equations. To those who played for him, Landry was both awe-inspiring and intimidating, a man whose intellect demanded respect. For the league at large, he represented a new archetype, the head coach as architect. As strategist, as ultimate authority in a sport that was now more about control than chaos. The Cowboys' opponents soon realized they were facing something entirely different. Landry's teams anticipated tendencies, countered alignments, and forced others into predictable mistakes. Even the most talented rosters struggled against that level of calculated preparation. Coaches around the league began adopting elements of his approach. Sid Gilman studied Landry's flexibility to refine his passing systems in San Diego. Chuck Noll in Pittsburgh drew from Landry's emphasis on structure to mold the steel curtain defense. Across the NFL, a quiet consensus was forming. Instinct alone could no longer win championships. Television magnified Landry's image as the embodiment of modern football intellect. In slow motion, his teams appeared almost choreographed. Each movement synchronized to create openings that seemed inevitable in hindsight. Analysts began to describe games as if they were battles between opposing systems rather than clashes of individuals. This was the language of a new era. Coaches were no longer just play callers. They were programmers of human performance. The deeper implication of Landry's rise was that football had entered a stage of self-awareness. The sport now reflected on its own logic, testing the limits of its rules and structures. What Unitas and Ewbank had introduced in 1958's film study, Audible's scripted drives had matured into a fully institutionalized mindset. Preparation was no longer just a tool. It was the culture itself. Players spoke of reading tendencies, not just reading defenses. Coaches installed game plans that could evolve within a single quarter based on live feedback. Landry's Cowboys became the prototype for what a disciplined football machine could look like. Yet within that brilliance lay a tension that would shape the decades ahead. As the system expanded, individuality contracted. Quarterbacks like Meredith and later Roger Staubach operated within Landry's framework, but often yearned for moments of freedom. Staubach, a Navy-trained competitor, respected Landry's order, but sometimes thrived when breaking from it. Those flashes of improvisation reminded fans of the sport's earlier soul, the spontaneity that had defined the pre-1958 era. The balance between structure and creativity became a central question in the evolution of play calling. Landry's influence extended beyond the field. His methods seeped into the culture of coaching itself. Younger coaches began approaching the game as a discipline of study rather than charisma. Detailed scouting, situational analysis, and film libraries became the foundation of every organization. The once chaotic sidelines turned into laboratories of coordination, filled with assistants charting tendencies and relaying data. The NFL had become a living equation, and Tom Landry had written its formula. By the time his Cowboys reached their apex in the late 1970s, the rest of the league had either adapted to his philosophy or fallen behind. Landry's quiet revolution had proven that systems could outlast stars, that intellect could define dominance. Even as the personalities of the sport grew louder, his methods remained the backbone of modern preparation. Every innovation that followed from Bill Walsh's West Coast precision to Belichick's situational mastery, traces of Landry's system mindset. The sport had learned to think deeply about itself. And that self-awareness began in the space between the playbook and the field, between theory and execution. Landry's Cowboys were the living embodiment of that intersection. In the end, Landry's legacy was not measured in wins alone, but in the permanence of his structure. He proved that the essence of football could be mapped, studied, and reproduced, and that the mind of the coach could shape the rhythm of the game as profoundly as any athlete on the field. He had turned play calling into science, transforming instinct into architecture. The 1958 championship had been the spark. Landry had built the fire into a system that would never burn out. By the time the 1980s arrived, the foundation laid in 1958 had matured into something more intricate, more deliberate, and more beautiful than anyone in Yankee Stadium could have imagined. The architects of modern football had learned to think in systems, but it was Bill Walsh who gave those systems rhythm and grace. If Tom Landry represented structure, Walsh represented synthesis. His West Coast offense was not simply a set of plays. It was an entire philosophy of control through timing and precision. It was the 1958 mindset reborn in motion. Before Walsh, the prevailing wisdom in football still leaned on brute force. Offenses relied on power formations and vertical passing, trying to overwhelm defenses through strength or distance. The short passing game existed, but it was seen as a sign of weakness, an admission that a team lacked the courage to attack deep. Walsh rejected that notion completely. He saw the field as a living chessboard, one that rewarded clarity of mind more than physical domination. To him, every pass was a means of maintaining tempo, of dictating the defense's reaction one small incision at a time. The roots of his revolution can be traced directly to the lineage that began with Unitas and Ewbank. Walsh studied the mechanics of passing offenses, dissecting film in the same analytical spirit that had first appeared in 1958. He realized that defenses had grown faster and more complex since the 1960s, making the traditional vertical game inefficient. The key to control was not distance, but timing. If an offense could anticipate coverage and place the ball in motion before defenders reacted, it could maintain possession and impose its rhythm on the game. This concept was not instinctual improvisation. It was orchestrated intelligence. When Walsh took over the San Francisco 49ers, he inherited a team with little reputation for innovation. Yet what he built would redefine how football was played and taught. The West Coast offense was constructed around short, high-percentage throws that functioned as extensions of the running game. Every route was timed to a fraction of a second. Every receiver's footwork calibrated to align with the quarterback's drop. The result was a seamless system where movement and thought were inseparable. Joe Montana became the living proof of Walsh's theory. He was not the strongest or the fastest quarterback, but he possessed the rare ability to process information at the speed of movement. Walsh taught him to see the field as a sequence of probabilities rather than chaos. Montana's calm within the pocket mirrored Unitas's composure decades earlier. But the difference was that every throw now belonged to a larger design. Each pass to a running back or slot receiver was part of a chain reaction intended to stretch defenses horizontally until their structure collapsed. The beauty of Walsh's offense lay in its balance between discipline and creativity. While every route was scripted, the quarterback was empowered to make instantaneous reads based on coverage. That relationship between structure and freedom echoed the same tension that had once existed between Landry's order and Staubach's improvisation. Walsh managed to fuse both into a single system, allowing instinct to operate within the boundaries of orchestration. It was football's equivalent of jazz, rigorous in theory, fluid in execution. This new form of play calling turned the act of passing into a conversation between minds. Defenders could no longer rely on predictability. Every motion, every shift, every angle of the receiver's stem forced them to think, to hesitate. In that hesitation lay the essence of Walsh's genius. He did not seek to overpower opponents, but to outthink them. Each drive was a demonstration of how intellect could control tempo and space, transforming football from a contest of reaction into one of manipulation. The influence of television once again magnified the revolution. Cameras captured the intricacy of the 49ers' offense, showing viewers patterns they had never fully noticed before. Audiences began to see football not just as spectacle, but as art, a complex interaction of timing and geometry. Commentators spoke of Walsh's rhythm passing and possession orchestration, terms that would have seemed foreign in the bruising, instinct-driven days before 1958. The game was no longer about collisions. was about the beauty of control. In practice, Walsh demanded a level of preparation that bordered on the academic. Every session was recorded, reviewed, and refined. Players were expected to memorize not just their routes, but the logic behind each design. Walsh encouraged them to understand why plays worked, not simply how to execute them. This intellectual engagement turned his teams into extensions of his mind. The process echoed Eubank's meticulous preparation and Landry's structural precision, but Walsh added emotional intelligence to the mix. He understood that discipline alone could suffocate creativity. His challenge was to make precision feel alive. When the 49ers captured their first Super Bowl in 1982, the victory was a validation of that synthesis. The final drive against Cincinnati, with Montana leading a calm, surgical advance down the field, felt like a reincarnation of Unitas's overtime drive in 1958. Every throw, every decision carried the same aura of inevitability. The difference was that what Unitas had done through instinct and courage, Walsh's offense could now replicate through design. Football had reached the stage where intelligence was no longer the hidden factor, it was the system itself. Beyond the scoreboard, Walsh's impact extended into the culture of coaching. His playbooks became foundational texts for a generation of strategists. Assistants such as Mike Holmgren, George Seifert, and Dennis Green carried his methods across the league, planting the seeds of a coaching tree that would shape the next 3 decades. The vocabulary of football evolved alongside them. Terms like timing routes, spacing concepts, and progression reads became standard language. What had once been abstract thought in 1958 had now become common syntax. Perhaps Walsh's greatest innovation was the emotional tone of his football. While Landry's Cowboys operated with machine-like precision, Walsh's 49ers carried a human rhythm. He believed that players performed best when they understood and trusted the system, not feared it. His leadership style was rooted in empathy and clarity. He coached minds as much as bodies, convincing his players that intelligence could be graceful. In doing so, he reconnected football's analytical evolution with its emotional roots. The West Coast offense was the natural conclusion of 2 decades of cognitive evolution. From Unitas's field vision to Landry's architecture, Walsh completed the transformation. He gave the game its most seamless union of intellect and art. When his teams lined up, the field became a study in moving harmony, every pass a deliberate note in a larger composition. Watching the 49ers in their prime was like watching thought in motion. By the end of the 1980s, nearly every major program in professional and collegiate football had borrowed from Walsh's concepts. His influence transcended play calling. It changed how the sport defined success. Efficiency replaced aggression as the highest virtue. The scoreboard no longer told the story of strength alone, but of clarity, precision, and balance. In the West Coast offense, football had finally realized the vision first glimpsed in the frozen night of 1958, a game that could think, adapt, and express intelligence through design. Walsh retired from the sideline with the understanding that his revolution was complete. What he had built was not a playbook, but a language, one that every generation after him would learn to speak in its own dialect. His teams had proved that strategy could be artful, that intellect could inspire emotion, and that control could coexist with beauty. The DNA of 1958 lived on in every precision route, every timed release, every calm drive that unfolded like a symphony of calculated grace. Football had grown beyond its instincts. It had learned to think with rhythm, to move with intention, to evolve through thought. By the middle of the 1980s, the balance of power in football had shifted so far toward offensive precision that a counterforce was inevitable. What Bill Walsh created in San Francisco forced every defensive mind in the league to rethink survival. The 1958 seed of systematized thought had blossomed into an era where every inch of field was calculated. If offenses had learned to think, then defenses would have to learn to anticipate thought itself. This realization gave birth to the most cerebral defensive era the sport had ever seen, And no figure embodied it more completely than Buddy Ryan. Ryan did not merely coach defense, he weaponized it. His players often said that he treated football as war, and in many ways, he did. But behind his aggressive reputation was a calculating mind that understood the evolving nature of the game. Walsh had used precision and timing to dismantle traditional defenses. Ryan sought to break that rhythm through chaos that was, paradoxically, meticulously designed. His system, known as the 46 defense, became the most feared and imitated scheme of its time. It was not built to contain. It was built to destroy. The 46 defense was named for safety Doug Plank, who wore number 46 for the Chicago Bears. Yet its deeper meaning ran through the structure of the lineup itself. Ryan flooded the line of scrimmage with pressure, aligning 8 men close to the ball and creating confusion over who would rush and who would retreat. The design forced quarterbacks to read and react faster than humanly comfortable. Timing routes and rhythm-based offenses, the hallmarks of the Walsh philosophy, suddenly faced a mirror image of their own complexity. Ryan's defense turned intellect against intellect. In an age defined by offensive artistry, Ryan brought back the language of violence, but with precision as its grammar. Every blitz was rehearsed with surgical discipline. Every shift in formation disguised intent while preserving structure. This was not the reckless aggression of earlier decades. It was the calculated inversion of the West Coast system. Walsh's offense had used short passes to create unpredictability. Ryan's defense used disguised blitzes to create the same effect from the other side of the ball. Both relied on deception, preparation, and intellect. The difference was philosophical. Walsh sought control. Ryan sought disruption. The 1985 Chicago Bears became the living embodiment of this philosophy. Under head coach Mike Ditka, with Ryan coordinating the defense, they produced one of the most dominant seasons in history. Their performance was not just physical domination, it was psychological warfare. Opposing quarterbacks spoke of confusion, of feeling pursued not just by bodies, but by ideas. Ryan's system collapsed the pocket before plays could fully develop. It was as if the defense anticipated each offensive concept before the snap, choking off the cerebral precision that Walsh and his disciples had popularized. In that season, the Bears allowed fewer than 11 points per game and forced turnovers with an almost mathematical regularity. The 46 defense forced offenses to abandon their scripts and return to instinct. In doing so, Ryan had achieved something profound. He had restored the element of unpredictability that had vanished since 1958, but through structure rather than chance. What began as a reaction to the rise of intelligence in offense had become intelligence itself, expressed through aggression. The ripple effect across the league was immediate. Every offensive coordinator had to account for the 46. Quarterbacks trained to process reads faster. Linemen drilled in recognition of shifting fronts. And coaches studied defensive tendencies with the same intensity they once reserved for passing trees. Ryan's system made preparation universal. Offenses could no longer assume command. They had to earn it every play. Ryan's approach also redefined the role of defensive players. In earlier eras, linemen and linebackers acted primarily as physical instruments, relying on strength and speed. Under Ryan, they became decision makers. Each player had to read alignment cues, interpret offensive formations, and adjust in real time. The 46 defense demanded as much intellect as power. In that sense, it fulfilled the evolution that began in 1958, the democratization of thought across the field. No longer did strategy reside solely with the quarterback or the head coach. Every position had to think. Yet, for all its brilliance, the 46 defense also revealed the cyclical nature of football innovation. Just as Walsh had forced defenses to adapt to horizontal precision, Ryan forced offenses to rediscover adaptability. Coaches like Joe Gibbs in Washington and Bill Parcells in New York began to modify their protections, introducing motion and shifting alignments to neutralize Ryan's pressure. offenses started to use quick screens and draw plays to exploit the space Ryan's defenders vacated in pursuit of the quarterback. The chess match continued, each move countered by another. Still, the legacy of the 46 defense went far beyond its tactical success. It marked the moment when defense became an equal participant in the intellectual evolution of the game. Before Ryan, defensive coordinators were often reactive, responding to offensive creativity with basic containment. After Ryan, they became innovators, crafting schemes with their own distinct philosophies. The names that followed, Belichick, Lebo, Kiffin, Rex Ryan, each carried forward that lineage of defensive intellect. In many ways, Buddy Ryan was a mirror image of the men who had shaped the offensive revolution before him. Like Weeb Ewbank, he believed in preparation. Like Tom Landry, he constructed systems that could sustain themselves beyond individual players. And like Bill Walsh, he saw football as a language of ideas. His difference lay in temperament. Ryan viewed control as a trap. He believed chaos, if managed correctly, was the ultimate weapon. His defenses thrived on emotional intensity, turning calculation into ferocity. That balance between structure and emotion made his teams uniquely dangerous. Ryan's influence continued long after his departure from Chicago. His philosophies spread through his sons, Rex and Rob, and through coaches who adapted his pressure concepts into modern hybrid defenses. The blitz packages seen today, from zone pressures to disguised fronts, owe their lineage to his designs. Even as offenses evolved into faster, spread-based systems, they continued to carry the imprint of Ryan's challenge. Every new formation, every shift in motion, was in part a response to the problem he posed: how to outthink aggression itself. The 46 defense symbolized more than a tactical innovation. It represented a cultural counterpoint to the era of offensive dominance. It reminded football that beauty could exist in destruction, that intelligence could express itself through confrontation as much as coordination. The balance of football's mind had been restored. Offense and defense now spoke the same language of preparation and deception, each forcing the other to evolve endlessly. In retrospect, the emergence of the 46 defense completed a circle that began in 1958, the game that once struggled. To think had become a dialogue between thinkers. Every formation, every audible, every adjustment was a conversation carried across the line of scrimmage. Unitas and Ewbank had taught the game to plan. Landry and Lombardi had taught it to structure. Walsh had taught it to orchestrate. Buddy Ryan taught it to resist. By the time the 1980s came to a close, football had transformed into a fully intellectual sport disguised in violence. The 1958 championship had planted the idea that the game could be designed. Ryan proved that even design could be challenged. That strategy was not a destination, but an argument without end. In every sack, every disguised blitz, and every quarterback hurried into mistake. The echoes of that argument could be heard. The defenses had learned to think, and in doing so, they had ensured that the evolution of football would never stop. How technology, film rooms, and analytics turned every down into data. By the late 20th century, football had transformed from instinct and improvisation into a discipline of calculated precision. The game that once relied on raw intuition began to submit to an empire of information. Film rooms replaced locker room debates, computers replaced chalkboards, and coaches became archivists of movement. The story of this transformation is not just about the rise of technology, but about the obsession with understanding what cannot be left to chance. The playbook was no longer a binder of plays, but a living organism of thought, growing more complex with each season, each innovation, each mind determined to outthink the next. It began in modest rooms filled with worry projectors. In the 1960s and 70s, coaches began to dissect game film with a new seriousness. What once had been a tool for curiosity became a weapon of control. Vince Lombardi was among the first to truly understand the potential. His assistants pored over footage, frame by frame, tracking tendencies, movement patterns, and behavioral cues. They discovered that the camera did not lie. Every hesitation, every adjustment at the line of scrimmage revealed the DNA of an opponent's mind. From this revelation, football began its descent into analytical obsession. By the 1980s, film study had become an expectation. Players were no longer simply expected to memorize routes or protections. They were expected to internalize tendencies, learn percentages, and predict outcomes. The playbook thickened. The language evolved. Formations multiplied. A play once drawn on a napkin could now fill an entire page of diagrams, each symbol tied to timing, spacing, and motion. Bill Walsh's West Coast system exemplified this evolution, but the revolution went beyond any one coach. Every team began to build a culture of strategic literacy. The NFL became a league of students and teachers, each trying to unlock the secrets hidden between frames of film. Technology accelerated that hunger. When computers entered the equation in the late 1980s, coaches gained the ability to break down hours of tape into searchable sequences. Suddenly, tendencies could be quantified. Play-by-play breakdowns became the foundation of preparation. Defensive coordinators could isolate how often a quarterback looked left before throwing right. Offensive coaches could predict blitzes from the depth of a safety or the angle of a linebacker's first step. The human element was being digitized, its mysteries rendered into data points. The game was no longer just about feel. It was about reading patterns that the eye alone could not always see. The playbook itself became a reflection of this new mindset. Coaches began to treat it as a classified document guarded like military intelligence. Within its pages lay hundreds of plays, each with minor variations depending on coverage, field position, or personnel. Some teams had binders so large that rookies joked about needing weeks just to read the table of contents. The complexity was overwhelming, but it was also intoxicating. To master a playbook was to master the game, and so preparation became identity. Quarterbacks became the field generals of this empire. They were not merely throwing the football. They were translating data into instinct under duress. Peyton Manning embodied this evolution. His mind operated like a computer, processing defensive formations, disguises, and leverage within seconds. His preparation was legendary. He spent nights memorizing every blitz look, every defensive audible, until the chaos of Sunday slowed to the rhythm of his understanding. Manning was not improvising. He was executing preloaded algorithms of probability. Each motion, each audible was an expression of knowledge. But for all its brilliance, the rise of the playbook empire came with consequences. The spontaneity that once defined the game began to erode. Coaches called plays through headsets, scripting entire drives in advance. Players executed with precision, but often without freedom. The art of reaction was replaced by the science of repetition. What had once been an exchange of instinct between offense and defense became a contest of who had better data. Still, the intelligence of the modern game could not be denied. Defensive coordinators now relied on digital breakdowns that mapped player efficiency across thousands of snaps. Offenses used analytics to determine optimal run-pass ratios, fourth down decisions, and play-action frequency. Teams invested in software that could simulate outcomes before they ever took the field. Coaches began to speak in probabilities instead of possibilities. The playbook became not just a set of strategies, but a manifestation of philosophy, that the game could be conquered through preparation. Film study rooms evolved into command centers. Massive screens displayed real-time data from multiple angles. Analysts and interns clipped and categorized plays by situation, player, and result. A 3rd and 7 from the opponent's 40-yard line could be studied across years of history, revealing tendencies invisible to the casual fan. The coach who once trusted his gut now trusted the numbers. Each snap became a case study. Each mistake, an opportunity to recalibrate the algorithm. As this culture deepened, the divide between teams that embraced analytics and those that resisted became stark. The organizations that adapted early gained a tactical edge. The New England Patriots under Bill Belichick thrived in this environment. Their preparation bordered on surveillance. Belichick demanded mastery of situational football, fueled by exhaustive study. Every opponent's weakness, every overlooked pattern, was cataloged. The Patriots' dominance was not only about talent. It was about information. They weaponized knowledge. Players, too, adapted to the new ecosystem. The best understood that mental preparation could extend careers. Veterans with diminishing physical gifts survived by knowing opponents better than opponents knew themselves. A linebacker could compensate for a lost step if he could anticipate the play before it developed. A receiver could find openings in zones, not by speed, but by pattern recognition. Knowledge became currency, and those who invested in it thrived. The culture extended beyond the field. Draft rooms became laboratories. Prospects were evaluated through digital performance data and psychological metrics. Scouting, once an art of observation, became a science of measurement. Teams hired analysts with backgrounds in mathematics, economics, and computer science. Algorithms joined the coaching staff. The playbook was no longer confined to paper. It existed in databases, visual models, and interactive simulations. And yet, beneath all this precision, the human element endured. Coaches still had to inspire. Players still had to execute under pressure. Data could predict tendencies, but not courage. The empire of the playbook could organize thought, but it could not measure heart. The best teams found balance. They merged intellect with instinct, preparation with improvisation. They understood that while football had become a science, it remained a human struggle for timing and trust. By the 2010s, the playbook had become something more than a document. It was a philosophy of control in a game built on chaos. Teams began to experiment with digital tablets on the sidelines, replacing binders with screens. Players studied formations in real time. Coaches uploaded new plays overnight. The pace of learning accelerated. The margin for error narrowed, and the boundaries of strategy expanded once again. This era redefined what intelligence meant in football. It was no longer enough to react. One had to anticipate, to preempt, to think at the speed of the game itself. Coaches spoke of football IQ as the defining trait of greatness. The brain became the most important muscle on the field. The empire of the playbook was complete, a civilization built upon the worship of preparation. What began as film reels flickering in dark rooms had become a total system of knowledge. Every down, every yard, every second was measured, analyzed, and stored. The game that once belonged to instinct now belonged to the mind. Football had evolved into its most cerebral form, a contest where memory, logic, and foresight ruled as much as strength or speed. The empire of the playbook stood as both triumph and warning. For in mastering every detail, the game risked losing the mystery that once made it beautiful. But even that tension became part of its evolution. Football had grown up. It had learned to think for itself. From Manning to Brady, mastering control at the line of scrimmage. By the dawn of the 21st century, the quarterback position had evolved into something closer to battlefield command. The line of scrimmage was no longer a place of reaction, but of orchestration. The men under center were expected not just to execute plays, but to interpret, adjust, and command them in real time. The evolution that began with Johnny Unitas and continued through Roger Staubach had reached its zenith in the minds of Peyton Manning and Tom Brady. Two figures who came to embody the intellectual and emotional architecture of modern football. They did not simply play the game. They directed it like composers at the height of their craft. The transformation of the quarterback's role was the product of decades of refinement. As the playbook empire expanded, quarterbacks became its custodians. They bore the weight of entire systems in their heads, decoding defenses while simultaneously managing tempo, personnel, and psychology. The huddle was their council chamber, and the line of scrimmage their command post. When Peyton Manning walked to the line, what looked like routine preparation was, in truth, a symphony of cognition. Every gesture, every word, every shift in cadence was calculated to manipulate the opponent. He did not simply call plays. He conducted information. Manning's era marked the height of autonomy. He demanded complete control of the offense, often calling his own plays at the line based on pre-snap reads. What made him extraordinary was not just his accuracy, but his anticipation. He could sense the disguise in a defense before the snap, the subtle tilt of a safety's shoulders, the faint movement of a linebacker creeping toward the gap. He absorbed these details in fractions of seconds, then changed the play with precision. His audibles became legend. Omaha, his most famous call, was not a single command, but a language of adjustment, signaling entire sequences depending on context. His mastery turned chaos into clarity. This was football at its most cerebral. Manning studied defenses with obsessive rigor. He spent entire weeks preparing for situations that might occur only once in a game. Teammates recalled his encyclopedic recall of tendencies and his ability to cite specific plays from years earlier as if they had happened yesterday. Preparation was his religion. He treated every snap as a test of intellect as much as execution. His power came not from improvisation, but from foresight. By the time the ball left his hand, the outcome had already been decided in his mind. Tom Brady, though different in temperament, shared that same command of control. Where Manning relied on orchestration, Brady thrived on adaptation. His mastery lay in his ability to interpret defensive intent at the last possible moment. He played with the patience of a strategist, waiting to expose the weakness hidden behind disguise. His pre-snap reads were silent, his adjustments subtle. He communicated with glances, gestures, and code words so refined that even teammates sometimes did not fully understand their depth until years later. Brady's understanding of leverage, timing, and coverage was instinctive yet honed through relentless study. He personified calm under pressure, a general whose composure dictated the tone of battle. Together, Manning and Brady redefined what quarterbacking meant. They were more than athletes. They were architects of tempo and emotion. They managed not only the play, but the rhythm of the entire game. When either took the field, time seemed to bend around them. Defenders could sense when the momentum shifted because they felt it in their body language. They knew they were no longer reacting to a play call, but to a mind several steps ahead. This psychological edge became one of the defining characteristics of the modern era. The quarterback as field general was not born overnight. It required the perfect convergence of technology, preparation, and trust. Coaches relinquished some control, allowing their quarterbacks to manipulate protections and route combinations as they saw fit. Offensive coordinators like Tom Moore and Josh McDaniels built systems that relied on the quarterback's interpretation of the field. The huddle became a place of translation, where code met instinct. It was no longer enough to memorize the playbook. One had to embody it. What separated the greats from the rest was command presence. Manning and Brady radiated authority that shaped how teammates responded. Their words carried weight because they were backed by evidence. Every decision was rooted in study. Every instruction derived from patterns identified across hours of film. They were, in essence, living algorithms. The rest of the offense became extensions of their processing power. Receivers adjusted routes based on shared understanding. Running backs adapted protection calls in sync with the quarterback's eyes. Offensive lines trusted the cadence, knowing it was part of a larger orchestration of deception. This transformation also changed how defenses prepared. Coordinators like Rex Ryan and Bill Belichick understood that they were not merely facing athletes, but minds. They developed disguise-heavy schemes, rotating coverages at the last second, presenting false fronts to disrupt pre-snap recognition. But even that evolution fed into the quarterback's growth. Manning began studying the art of deception itself, learning to read intent beneath disguise. Brady learned to weaponize patience, refusing to reveal his plan until the defense fully committed. What emerged was a chess match unlike any other era in football history. At the heart of it was control. Quarterbacks in this new age did not wait for instruction. They dictated the flow. Manning might spend 40 seconds at the line, manipulating formations, shifting tight ends, resetting protections, and using motion to expose coverage. He created movement where there was none, forcing defenses to reveal themselves. Brady operated at a different rhythm, often using tempo and pace to catch defenses off guard. He turned no-huddle drives into precision warfare, executing entire sequences before opponents could reset. In both approaches, the essence was the same: complete command over every variable. This evolution extended beyond the field. Preparation itself became an art form. Quarterbacks led film sessions, guided teammates through defensive concepts, and demanded mental discipline equal to physical conditioning. Brady's midnight film studies were legendary. Manny's off-season work with receivers was surgical. Every route rehearsed until it reached the exact depth and timing required. Their dedication transformed the quarterback room into a classroom of precision. Young quarterbacks entering the league soon learned that intelligence, not arm strength, defined the ceiling of their success. What made their leadership transcendent was how it connected intellect to emotion. Both men understood the psychological current of the game. Manning's fiery competitiveness set the tone for his teams. Brady's measured confidence steadied his. They led through presence. Teammates trusted them not just because they were prepared, but because they projected inevitability. When either stepped onto the field in the fourth quarter, belief became contagious. Their control created order in moments of chaos. Behind that control was an almost obsessive relationship with time. Manning's rhythm was metronomic, his cadences precise to the millisecond. Brady, too, manipulated time as a weapon, quickening or slowing tempo to exploit defensive fatigue. Their understanding of situational football was absolute. They calculated down distance, clock, and field position like mathematicians. Every decision had purpose. Every audible was a correction in pursuit of efficiency. This intellectual mastery changed how offenses were built. Systems became more adaptable, less rigid. Playbooks contained options that relied on quarterback reads rather than fixed design. Concepts like kill calls, where the quarterback could switch between two plays based on defensive alignment, became standard. The quarterback had become both executor and architect. Coaches no longer micromanaged from the sideline. They collaborated. The field general had earned the trust of the institution. The legacy of Manning and Brady endures not simply in records or championships, but in the expectation they set. They raised the standard of mental preparation to unprecedented heights. Their dominance proved that the quarterback position was as much about cognition as it was about physical skill. They demonstrated that control was not merely about authority, but about mastery of information and execution under pressure. The archetype they created still defines the position today. Young quarterbacks now enter the league expected to process coverage rotations, pre-snap disguises, and post-snap adjustments with instantaneous precision. The language of the line of scrimmage has become universal. What was once an art has become an institution. The quarterback as field general is now the cornerstone of professional football's identity. In the end, the brilliance of Manning and Brady lies in how they made control beautiful. They turned complexity into rhythm, knowledge into instinct, and preparation into art. They proved that the mind could dominate a sport built on violence. In mastering the chaos of the line of scrimmage, they redefined leadership itself. How headsets, cameras, and coordination redefined the architecture of control. By the early 21st century, the sideline had become the nerve center of modern football. The game that once relied on instinct and on-field improvisation was now orchestrated through technology, communication, and meticulous coordination. The evolution that began with Johnny Unitas reading defenses and Weeb Ewbank structuring offenses had reached a stage where intelligence could be transmitted instantly across the width of the field. The quarterback's mind remained central, but the sideline itself had become a powerful extension of that intellect. The introduction of headsets was more than a convenience. It fundamentally altered the pace and structure of play calling. Coaches could now communicate directly with quarterbacks, transmitting adjustments, audibles, and schemes in real time. Where once the quarterback bore the full cognitive load, he could now leverage the collective intelligence of his staff. Offensive coordinators could monitor the defensive alignment, recognize tendencies, and provide instant feedback without leaving the sideline. The game that had once been reactive was now proactive, with decision-making distributed across a network of trained minds. The role of cameras in this system was equally transformative. Broadcast technology and internal filming allowed coaches to observe angles that had previously been invisible. Each snap could be studied immediately. Tendencies could be confirmed or questioned, and the next series could be adjusted with precision. Film rooms expanded from a post-game analysis tool into a live, iterative process. Every defensive movement, every subtle shift, could be relayed to the quarterback with context. The sideline became a laboratory where data met instinct and strategy could evolve in real time. This integration of communication and observation demanded a new type of discipline from coaches and players alike. Coordinators had to synthesize incoming information rapidly, distill it into actionable insight, and convey it clearly through headsets. Quarterbacks had to interpret the instructions, line them with their pre-snap reads, and adjust protections or route combinations instantly. Execution was no longer simply about memorization. It required understanding the logic behind each adjustment. The sideline had become a classroom, a command post, and a battlefield all at once. The architecture of control extended beyond single plays. Game planning became a continuous loop of observation, feedback, and adaptation. Assistant coaches, analysts, and scouts contributed intelligence that would be leveraged immediately. They tracked tendencies, personnel groupings, and opponent behavior down to the smallest details. Sideline communication allowed these observations to influence every sequence of the game. Coaches could call audibles for formation adjustments, suggest motion to expose weaknesses, and instruct quarterbacks on how to manipulate defensive alignment before the snap. The quarterback, once the sole strategist, now had a direct line to the collective mind of the coaching staff. This system shifted the balance of power on the field. The quarterback's autonomy was tempered by the real-time intelligence available from the sideline. Decisions that previously relied entirely on individual perception were now supported by a network of data. The play caller could provide context, recommend options, and validate reads instantly. The quarterback became both executor and collaborator, blending preparation with insight drawn from an entire coaching hierarchy. The integration of technology and human judgment created a new layer of strategic depth previously unseen in professional football. With headsets and cameras, the tempo of the game could be manipulated deliberately. Teams began to employ strategies that controlled the pace, slowing the defense with calculated cadences or accelerating to exploit fatigue. Quick snaps, no-huddle sequences, and tempo variations became more effective because the sideline could provide guidance in real time. The quarterback could adjust protections or route combinations based on immediate input. And coaches could respond to defensive shifts within seconds. The game became a dynamic exchange of intelligence, with every snap providing new data for the next decision. This revolution also altered the preparation process. Pre-game meetings, previously reliant on projection and rehearsal, could now incorporate live observations. Teams could review footage from other games and adjust their approach on the fly. Real-time statistical analysis allowed coordinators to confirm tendencies, identify exploitable patterns, and instruct the quarterback accordingly. Sideline communication and camera technology made preparation a continuous, iterative process that extended into the flow of the game itself. No play occurred in isolation. Every series became part of an evolving narrative informed by both observation and analytics. The influence of this system on defensive strategy was profound. Its opponents recognized that the offense was no longer purely reactive. Defensive coordinators developed more complex disguises, shifting coverages, and varied pressures to counter the increased intelligence flowing from the sideline. The game evolved into a conversation between offense and defense, mediated by technology. Blitzes were timed to intercept audibles. Zone rotations were altered to confuse quarterbacks listening for instructions. The chess match that had begun in the 1958 championship had transformed into a dialogue conducted in real time through electronics and observation. Coaches like Bill Belichick exemplified the power of this architecture. His staff used sideline communication to constantly adjust play calls, exploit mismatches, and anticipate defensive behavior. Brady, as quarterback, became the perfect extension of this system, processing the information from his coaching staff while executing with near-perfect precision. The synergy between preparation, observation, and communication elevated both individual and team performance. Every decision was informed by collective intelligence, yet executed through individual skill and judgment. Even the culture of the game shifted as a result. Players became more accountable to the system. Quarterbacks were expected to understand not only the physical execution of a play, but the strategic rationale behind every adjustment. Receivers and running backs needed to internalize the logic of protections, motion, and route concepts, so they could respond seamlessly to sideline instructions. The game demanded mental agility alongside physical ability. Teams that could integrate intelligence with execution dominated. Those that could not fell behind. The Sideline Revolution also democratized preparation. Information was no longer siloed within a single brain. Analysts, coordinators, and position coaches contributed insight in real time, creating a collective intelligence network. Quarterbacks became conduits through which this intelligence flowed onto the field. The era of a single mind carrying the burden of strategy was over. Now, every participant in the system had a role in the orchestration of control. Football had become both more cerebral and more collaborative. By the mid-2000s, the combination of headsets, cameras, and real-time coordination defined modern football. Strategy was no longer limited to X's and O's on a chalkboard. It extended into an interactive system of observation, analysis, and execution. The line of scrimmage was both battlefield and classroom, where ideas competed as fiercely as bodies. Preparation extended into in-game adjustments, and decisions were informed by a wealth of intelligence once unimaginable. Every snap contained layers of strategy transmitted from sideline to quarterback in seconds. This architecture of control reflected the cumulative evolution of the sport. What began as Unitas reading a defense had matured into a system where information was as crucial as strength or skill. The quarterback remained central, but he was supported by a network capable of extending cognition across the field. The sideline was no longer passive. It was active, a hub of command that shaped the outcome of the game with precision. In the end, the Sideline Revolution did not replace the human element of football. It amplified it. Coordination, communication, and technology provided tools for execution, but success still depended on judgment, courage, and timing. The quarterback, coaches, and players all had to act in concert, translating preparation into performance under pressure. The architecture of control had matured, but the challenge of mastering it remained profoundly human. Through headsets, cameras, and real-time coordination, football became a game of collective intelligence applied under duress. The Sideline Revolution ensured that strategy, once confined to the mind of a single player, could now orchestrate an entire team. The evolution that began with the 1958 championship had reached a new dimension. Control had become both system and art, distributed yet precise, calculated yet alive. The game had entered an era where intelligence traveled faster than the ball, and preparation dictated the flow of every play. The 21st century shift, decisions ruled by probability, not intuition. As the NFL entered the 21st century, the nature of decision-making on the field began to transform in ways that few outside the sport could fully appreciate. The era of gut instinct, where a quarterback or coach made split-second decisions based on feel or experience alone, was giving way to a culture governed by probability, data, and analysis. Every choice, from when to go for it on fourth down to the sequencing of play calls in critical situations, was increasingly dictated by measurable outcomes. Analytics had arrived in professional football, reshaping the game in ways both subtle and profound. The shift was gradual, but inexorable. Early adopters of analytical thinking began by cataloging success rates on conventional decisions. They looked at fourth down conversion percentages, red zone efficiency, and historical tendencies in specific situations. What might once have been dismissed as intuition punting on fourth and short or relying on a quarterback's instinct to read a zone blitz was now scrutinized against decades of data. Patterns emerged, and with them, a new language of probability that would come to dominate coaching strategy. By the late 2000s, teams were hiring statisticians and analysts, merging traditional scouting and coaching experience with mathematical rigor. This intellectual partnership was not just about improving performance. It was about reducing uncertainty. Coaches now approached every decision as a calculation. They measured risk and reward with a precision previously unimaginable. Fourth down was no longer an emotional choice or a conservative reflex. It became a matter of expected value, a probability exercise in which historical data and situational context informed each call. Quarterbacks, too, were swept into this analytical revolution. Their training extended beyond film study and physical repetition. They now had to internalize statistical tendencies of defenses, weigh matchup probabilities, and consider the impact of weather, field position, and time remaining. Plays were no longer called purely for strategic fit or instinctual advantage. They were selected based on their probability of success. The quarterback became a processor of data as much as a physical performer. Success was now a function of preparation and execution informed by empirical evidence. One consequence of this shift was the diminishing role of instinct. The moments of improvisational brilliance that had characterized football in the 20th century scrambles. Audibles and improvisational pass began to occur less frequently, or at least they were increasingly guided by analytical insight. Coaches and players learned to trust data over intuition, and the culture of the league reflected that trust. When a quarterback chose a play based on feel alone, it was considered reckless. When he followed the guidance of probability, even the smallest edge could be leveraged to victory. The impact extended to game planning. Offensive coordinators constructed sequences based on the likelihood of success against specific defensive alignments. Defensive coordinators, in turn, anticipated offensive tendencies derived from statistical patterns. Preparation became a feedback loop in which every decision was analyzed, adjusted, and optimized. The randomness of the game, once a defining element, was increasingly constrained by calculations that sought to minimize variance and maximize efficiency. Some veterans and analysts lamented the loss of instinct. They argued that the beauty of football lay in the unpredictability of human decision-making. In the moments when experience and intuition intersected to create genius, but the results spoke for themselves. Teams that embraced analytics gained measurable advantages, scored more fourth downs, scored more efficiently in the red zone, and made fewer critical errors. The probabilistic approach was not infallible, but it provided a framework that had once been unimaginable in the purely instinct-driven game of previous decades. This evolution also altered the way players were evaluated. Draft metrics and performance data began to supplement or even supplant traditional scouting. Quarterbacks were measured not only by arm strength or mobility, but by their ability to process information, read defenses, and execute decisions with probabilistic precision. Running backs were assessed for efficiency per touch, pass protect effectiveness, and decision-making in pressure situations. Analytics introduced a level of objectivity that challenged traditional scouting conventions, and it changed the way talent was acquired and utilized. One of the most visible effects of analytics was the emergence of unconventional strategies that defied traditional football wisdom. The decision to go for it on 4th and long, once considered reckless, became commonplace when data suggested a higher likelihood of success than punting or kicking a field goal. The use of two-point conversions, tempo shifts, and aggressive play calling in critical moments were increasingly informed by statistical analysis. What appeared to fans as boldness or audacity was in many cases the result of meticulous calculation. The illusion of instinct had been replaced by informed probability. Quarterbacks adapted accordingly. They learned to recognize situations where adherence to conventional wisdom was suboptimal. Peyton Manning, already a master of pre-snap intelligence, incorporated situational analytics into his decision-making, enhancing what was already a cerebral approach. Tom Brady, similarly, integrated statistical tendencies into his real-time reads, allowing him to make precise choices under pressure. These quarterbacks represented the pinnacle of the analytical era, marrying preparation, experience, and probability into decisive action. Yet the transition was not seamless. Integrating analytics into real-time football presented challenges. The sheer volume of information could overwhelm players. Coaches had to distill complex data into actionable guidance that could be executed within seconds. The margin for error became razor-thin, as incorrect interpretation or delayed response could result in catastrophic outcomes. Mastery of analytics required discipline, focus, and a new type of mental toughness that complemented the traditional demands of the sport. Critics of the analytical approach also warned of its cultural impact. They feared the erosion of instinct, spontaneity, and human judgment. The game, once a theater of improvisation and courage, risked becoming formulaic. Moments of brilliance derived from intuition could be suppressed in favor of statistically optimal plays. Some argued that the soul of football was being sacrificed for measurable efficiency. Yet the counter-argument was compelling. The evolution was a natural progression of strategy. Just as Weeb Ewbank and Tom Landry transformed preparation in 1958, analytics represented the next logical stage in the continuous refinement of football intelligence. By the 2010s, the dominance of analytics was undeniable. Teams with robust data departments outperformed those relying solely on traditional scouting. Advanced metrics guided personnel decisions, play selection, and in-game adjustments. The game had become a laboratory where probability ruled. Even fans began to understand the role of data, tracking expected points, win probability, and situational success rates. Analytics had not only transformed coaching, but also reshaped public understanding of the sport. Despite the pervasive influence of analytics, instinct did not vanish entirely. The most successful quarterbacks found a way to integrate probability with intuition, blending calculated risk with split-second judgment. Football, after all, remained a game of motion, physicality, and unpredictability. Analytics provided a framework, but human skill determined its application. The great quarterbacks of the modern era learned to trust the data while trusting themselves, merging empirical insight with the nuanced art of playmaking. In reflecting on this transformation, it is clear that the death of instinct was not absolute. Instead, instinct was reshaped, refined, and subordinated to strategy. The quarterback's decisions, once guided primarily by experience and feel, were now informed by patterns, tendencies, and statistical probability. Every throw, every audible, every snap became part of a carefully considered equation. Football had become a game of intelligence, discipline, and calculation. The art of improvisation had not disappeared, but had evolved into a disciplined, data-informed practice. The rise of analytics marked the culmination of decades of strategic evolution. From the 1958 championship to the 21st century, football had moved steadily from instinct to preparation, from improvisation to orchestration, from gut calls to calculated probabilities. Analytics did not eliminate creativity. it redefined it. It created a new language of decision-making, a system in which every action was informed by evidence, and every choice could be measured against historical precedent. The game had entered an era where knowledge became as vital as speed or strength. In the end, the analytical revolution demonstrated that football was not only a contest of physical skill, but of cognition, preparation, and judgment. The 21st century quarterback became a field general in a world dominated by data. Coaches and players learned to navigate probability, interpret tendencies, and execute with precision. The game had evolved to a point where instinct alone was insufficient. Success required mastery of information, the ability to apply it under pressure, and the discipline to make decisions that balanced probability with opportunity. The shift to analytics represents both a triumph and a transformation. It shows how the sport continues to adapt, refine, and optimize. It is a story that traces its lineage from the 1958 championship, through the rise of strategic masterminds, to the sophisticated, data-driven game of today. Football has become a sport in which preparation, knowledge, and probability coexist with human skill. The death of pure instinct marks not an end, but an evolution, a redefinition of what it means to excel in the most cerebral form of America's game. How play-calling precision began to dehumanize players, perfection at all costs. The rise of meticulously engineered play-calling brought with it a stark and often overlooked consequence. As strategy evolved from instinct to architecture, from gut decisions to probabilities, the human element of football began to feel the strain. Players were no longer solely athletes executing a game plan. They had become instruments in a machine designed for precision, efficiency, and predictability. The evolution that elevated the game intellectually came at a cost. The drive for perfection, once the ideal, now imposed psychological and physical pressures that were relentless, unforgiving, and in many cases invisible to fans. This was a shift that began subtly but gained momentum as coaching, philosophy, and technology advanced. Quarterbacks, linemen, receivers, and running backs found themselves held accountable not just for outcomes, but for execution against a standard of flawless adherence to schemes and timing. Every step mattered. Every motion carried meaning. The margin for error narrowed dramatically. Practices became rehearsals for perfect performance rather than preparation for adaptability. Every misstep could compromise a series, a game, or a season. In the pursuit of precision, the unpredictable human element was increasingly seen as a liability rather than a source of creative advantage. The mental load on players intensified. Quarterbacks were expected to process vast amounts of information instantaneously. Receivers needed to synchronize routes with timing accurate to a fraction of a second. Offensive linemen were required to anticipate blitzes, rotate protections, and execute blocks with perfect alignment. Running backs studied defensive tendencies and pre-snap reads to ensure they moved precisely where the plan dictated. In a game once defined by split-second improvisation and athletic daring, the cognitive burden became staggering. Success demanded both physical skill and near-perfect mental execution. Mistakes were no longer tolerable. They were costly. For quarterbacks, this pressure was most apparent. The line between preparation and obsession blurred. Each decision required exhaustive knowledge of the playbook, defensive tendencies, situational probabilities, and the capacity to interpret information in real time. Peyton Manning spent hours memorizing formations and tendencies, internalizing patterns so that execution could occur almost automatically. Tom Brady, already renowned for his discipline, meticulously cataloged defenses and rehearsed every possible scenario. While their mastery produced historic performances, the psychological weight of sustaining that level of preparation exacted a human toll. Fatigue, stress, and the constant demand for precision became omnipresent companions. The relentless focus on perfection extended to physical execution as well. Receivers practiced timing to the hundredth of a second. Linemen drilled assignments to exact specifications, Running backs refined footwork to reduce exposure to mistakes or injury. Conditioning, nutrition, and rehabilitation became subjects of precise measurement, all in service of maintaining an optimal system. Football had become a sport where the body was as much a data point as a weapon. Every action was analyzed, quantified, and optimized, and every deviation was a potential point of failure. The human cost also manifested in the culture of accountability within teams. Coaches demanded flawless adherence to the system, and players internalized these expectations. Errors were often met with frustration or criticism, magnifying the pressure to perform without deviation. The ethos of perfection became ingrained at every level of the sport. Players learned that lapses in focus, hesitation, or even natural human variation could have amplified consequences. The drive to excel, once a motivating force, was now intertwined with fear of error and the unrelenting standard of exactitude. Injuries, both physical and psychological, became an inevitable aspect of this era. Players pushed their bodies to execute with mechanical precision, often at the expense of natural instincts that had once mitigated harm. The demand for timing, alignment, and precise execution increased exposure to repetitive strain and acute injuries. The mental strain of sustaining peak cognitive performance under constant scrutiny contributed to stress, anxiety, and a psychological burden that mirrored the physical one. The pursuit of perfection created athletes who were finely tuned yet fragile, human beings functioning as near automata. The human cost was particularly evident in positions requiring split-second decisions under extreme pressure. Quarterbacks, facing increasingly complex defenses and data-driven play calling, bore a disproportionate share of responsibility. Mistakes were dissected through film, statistics, and analytics, often amplified by media coverage and public scrutiny. The feedback loop reinforced the notion that perfection was the baseline expectation. Mistakes were no longer treated as learning opportunities, but as failures to uphold the system. The psychological impact was profound, fostering resilience in some and stress in others. Receivers and running backs experienced parallel pressures. Timing routes required coordination down to precise increments, and even a slight deviation could disrupt an entire series. Linebackers and defensive backs, too, were caught in the system, as offenses engineered spacing and timing to exploit weaknesses. Every player became accountable for the successful execution of a plan they did not individually design. The collaborative nature of football had evolved into a system where each participant's performance was inseparable from the collective outcome, increasing stress and reducing the margin for error. While the pursuit of perfection elevated the technical quality of football, it also reshaped the emotional experience of the game for players. The thrill of improvisation and creative problem-solving was often replaced with meticulous adherence to predetermined sequences. Moments of spontaneous genius became exceptions rather than norms. The artistry of instinct, once a hallmark of the sport, was subordinated to consistency and reliability. The joy of unpredictable athletic expression was increasingly constrained by the demands of a system optimized for success. Coaches, too, bore responsibility for the human cost. The architecture of control that had once amplified performance also amplified pressure. The expectation of perfection became systemic, embedded in practice schedules, pre-snap routines, and performance evaluations. Leadership required balancing strategic oversight with empathy, a challenge that not all succeeded in meeting. For some, the relentless drive for execution created environments where mental fatigue and stress were normalized, and human vulnerability was undervalued. Yet, despite these pressures, players continued to perform at extraordinary levels. The human ability to adapt, endure, and internalize expectation allowed athletes to operate within the system and still find moments of brilliance. Quarterbacks like Brady and Manning navigated the cognitive load with near-mechanical efficiency, while preserving the capacity for instinct when necessary. Receivers and linemen internalized timing, route precision, and assignments to execute under pressure. The very system that imposed strain also enabled exceptional performance, creating a paradox where human cost and human achievement were inseparable. The human cost of perfection was not limited to professional players. As football culture evolved, these expectations trickled down to collegiate and youth levels. Young athletes were trained in precise timing, rigid systems, and analytical preparation at earlier ages, potentially amplifying the psychological and physical pressures associated with perfection. The ethos of exact execution became a standard across levels of play, redefining what it meant to be successful in football from adolescence to the professional stage. Ultimately, the human cost underscores a tension inherent in the evolution of the game. Strategy, precision, and analytical rigor have transformed football into a highly efficient, intellectually demanding sport. Yet this same transformation places extraordinary demands on the players who execute it. They are celebrated for their skill and intelligence while carrying the weight of expectation, precision, and constant scrutiny. The pursuit of perfection has created a remarkable spectacle of achievement, but has also highlighted the fragility of human endurance within a system designed for mechanical excellence. In reflecting on this tension, it becomes clear that the evolution of play calling and preparation is inseparable from the human experience of the game. Every snap, every route, every decision carries not only strategic significance, but emotional and physical weight. The pursuit of perfection has redefined both the demands and the rewards of football, creating a paradox in which extraordinary achievement exists alongside continuous pressure and accountability. The cost of this evolution is measured not only in victories and championships, but in the human effort required to sustain it. The legacy of the Sideline Revolution, analytics, and precision play calling is thus twofold. It demonstrates the heights that can be reached when preparation, strategy, and execution converge. It also reveals the profound human demands embedded within that system. Football has become both a game of intellect and endurance, where players are celebrated for perfection, yet bear the burden of sustaining it under conditions that are relentless and unforgiving. The human cost is real, pervasive, and integral to understanding the modern era of the sport. In the end, perfection comes at a price. The evolution from instinct to architecture has produced a game that is faster, smarter, and more precise than ever before. Yet, behind every perfectly executed play is a human being navigating the psychological and physical pressures of a system designed for excellence. The story of modern football is inseparable from the story of the individuals who sustain it, whose skill, discipline, and resilience are both the source of triumph and the measure of human cost. Improvisation reborn within structure, how creativity finds its way back. The evolution of football had long followed a steady trajectory from instinct to preparation to analytics. For decades, the game was engineered with precision. Every snap, route, and block was optimized for efficiency and probability. Quarterbacks became masters of decision trees, executing predetermined sequences under enormous cognitive and physical pressure. Yet in the modern era, a subtle but profound shift began to emerge. Patrick Mahomes and his contemporaries demonstrated that chaos could return to the game, not in opposition to structure, but as an extension of it. Creativity found its way back into a system that had once almost entirely stifled it. Patrick Mahomes entered the league with a skill set that defied conventional categorization. His arm strength allowed him to make throws from angles previously considered impossible. His footwork, mobility, and spatial awareness enabled him to extend plays and improvise in ways that would have been inconceivable in earlier decades of highly structured football. Mahomes was not simply a product of instinct. He was the culmination of decades of evolution in play calling, preparation, and analytical support. He could see the field, process tendencies, and yet choose to act outside conventional options when opportunity demanded. His improvisation was informed by intelligence, not randomness. The Mahomes era represents a reconciliation of control and chaos. Offensive coordinators design systems that anticipate defensive alignment, tendencies, and probability. Every player is coached to understand the timing and rhythm of each series. Yet Mahomes operates within these structures while introducing unpredictability that stretches defenses beyond calculated limits. A throw on the run to a receiver breaking toward the sideline, or a no-look pass to a tight end slipping behind coverage demonstrates a level of improvisational creativity that complements, rather than contradicts, preparation. Chaos has been codified as a tool rather than an anomaly. This new approach to improvisation is rooted in the learning and practices of the modern game. Quarterbacks like Mahomes inherit decades of accumulated knowledge, analytical tools, and coaching sophistication. The intelligence embedded in the system provides a foundation from which creative decisions can be made safely and effectively. Mahomes is not reckless. His chaos is disciplined. He understands the probabilities and limitations of each scenario and manipulates them to his advantage. Improvisation is therefore a calculated risk, integrated into the architecture of control rather than existing in isolation. The rise of Mahomes and his contemporaries also reflects a shift in coaching philosophy. Offensive coordinators have begun to value adaptability as much as adherence to the playbook. Play design now incorporates options for improvisation, rolling pockets, and read progressions that encourage decision-making beyond predetermined routes. Quarterbacks are trained to recognize these moments, to execute when opportunity presents itself, and to balance instinct with preparation. The Mahomes era demonstrates that football is capable of reconciling structured preparation with human spontaneity, restoring an element of unpredictability that had been minimized in prior decades. This improvisational style has profound implications for defensive strategy. Defenses trained to predict quarterback decisions based on statistical probability and analytical tendencies find themselves facing new challenges. When Mahomes extends a play or improvises a throw to an unconventional target, traditional preparation and probability charts are rendered temporarily ineffective. Defenses must respond dynamically, relying once again on instinct, communication, and rapid adaptation. In this way, chaos re-enters the game not as a flaw, but as a deliberate weapon, forcing both sides to engage in a renewed contest of anticipation and reaction. The psychological impact of this evolution is equally significant. Players must cultivate confidence in their ability to make instantaneous decisions under high pressure, relying on skill, situational awareness, and judgment. Mahomes embodies this duality. He executes within a structure, but simultaneously trusts his instincts to deviate when advantageous. Receivers and linemen adapt to his improvisation, learning to anticipate unconventional decisions and adjust accordingly. The system that once demanded perfection now accommodates creativity, expanding the spectrum of potential outcomes while preserving strategic integrity. This return of chaos is not a regression. It is a culmination of decades of refinement. The precision developed over time provides the foundation from which improvisation can be effective. Mahomes does not abandon structure. He uses it as a springboard. His mobility, field vision, and arm talent are tools amplified by preparation and insight. The chaos he introduces is intelligible, meaningful, and repeatable. It is a new form of mastery in football, a hybrid of instinct and structure that elevates both the individual and the team. Statistical analysis supports the effectiveness of this approach. Plays that involve improvisation often yield higher expected points when executed by quarterbacks of Mahomes' caliber. The success of rolling pocket throws, sidearm passes, and deep improvisational reads reflects a new understanding of probability. Chaos can be optimized within a system if the player has the skill and intelligence to exploit it. This realization has influenced coaching philosophy across the league, encouraging coordinators to design systems that provide room for improvisation without sacrificing strategic integrity. Mahomes' influence extends beyond individual performance. Teams that face his improvisational style are forced to innovate defensively. Traditional reads and alignments may fail under the pressure of unpredictability, Linebackers and safeties must make split-second adjustments without full reliance on statistical tendencies. Defensive communication and coordination become paramount. The reintroduction of chaos challenges both sides to evolve, creating a feedback loop in which unpredictability and preparation coexist. The Mahomes era also speaks to the enduring human element of football. Despite decades of analytics, technological advancement, and sideline coordination, the sport remains fundamentally a human endeavor. Talent, intuition, and creativity can still disrupt the most sophisticated systems. Improvisation, when executed by a skilled practitioner, cannot be fully quantified or constrained. Mahomes exemplifies the capacity of human agency to reshape the parameters of a game built on systems and analysis. It is a reminder that no matter how much the sport evolves, the unpredictability of human decision-making remains central to its drama and spectacle. Fans and commentators alike have recognized this shift. Mahomes' performances are celebrated not only for efficiency and results, but for the artistry of his improvisation. Moments that would have been anomalies in prior decades are now signature elements of his play. The combination of preparation, intelligence, and improvisational freedom produces sequences that are as thrilling as they are technically sophisticated. Chaos is no longer a threat to the system. It is a strategic asset, fully integrated into the architecture of modern football. As the NFL continues to evolve, the Mahomes era signals a broader lesson. Structure and creativity are not mutually exclusive. The game has come full circle. From the instinct-driven early years through the analytical and sideline-dominated era, football has now entered a period where preparation enables, rather than suppresses, human spontaneity. Quarterbacks like Mahomes demonstrate that even in a world of probability, data, and strategy, the human mind and body can reclaim space for improvisation. The return of chaos is a testament to the adaptability of the sport. It shows that football can evolve in complexity while preserving the essence of unpredictability that makes it compelling. The Mahomes era is a synthesis of the lessons learned over 60 years, the precision of preparation, intelligence of analytics, and the artistry of instinct. It reaffirms that the game at its core thrives on the tension between control and improvisation, between planning and execution, between probability and human ingenuity. Ultimately, the Mahomes era demonstrates that football is capable of balance. It is a game where preparation meets opportunity, where strategy and improvisation coexist, and where creativity can flourish within a structured system. Chaos, once feared as a threat to consistency, has returned as a tool for innovation. The evolution that began with the 1958 championship continues, proving that even in the most controlled environments, human skill and ingenuity remain essential to the game's enduring drama and excitement. Spread formations, RPOs, and the digital age, the echoes of 1958 in every no-huddle, call the offensive landscape of the modern NFL bears little resemblance to the game that existed before 1958, yet it carries an unmistakable lineage from that pivotal championship. Spread formations, run-pass options, and the digital integration of coaching and preparation have transformed the field into a laboratory of possibilities. Every no-huddle drive, every motion shift, and every RPO reflects decades of evolution rooted in the principles first glimpsed on that cold December night. The game has become faster, more fluid, and more data-driven. Yet the essence of calculated decision-making that began with Johnny Unitas and Weeb Ewbank still resonates in every snap. The spread offense, which has become a staple at both collegiate and professional levels, exemplifies the evolution of space and tempo in modern football. By stretching defenses horizontally across the field, offenses force defenders to cover more ground and make instantaneous decisions under pressure. Quarterbacks now read multiple defenders simultaneously, using pre-snap indicators to anticipate coverage and adjust the play. This concept, though refined and accelerated in the 21st century, is a direct descendant of the strategic thinking that emerged in 1958. Unitas, audibles, and improvisation were early explorations of exploiting defensive vulnerabilities. modern spread offenses take that principle to its logical extreme, combining athleticism, intelligence, and preparation into a cohesive system designed to maximize opportunity. Run-pass options, or RPOs, have further revolutionized offensive strategy. By giving the quarterback the choice to hand the ball off, keep it, or throw, based on the defensive alignment and reaction. RPOs create a dynamic threat that forces defenders into a dilemma. This innovation, ubiquitous in contemporary football, relies on instantaneous processing, precise execution, and rigorous preparation. In essence, RPOs institutionalize the same principle that defined Unitas' approach: the ability to make real-time decisions that exploit defensive tendencies. The technology and data available today enhance this principle, providing quarterbacks and coordinators with predictive insights that guide those split-second choices. The digital age has also transformed play calling and preparation. Coaches now have access to extensive databases of opponent tendencies, situational probabilities, and advanced metrics that allow them to tailor strategies to unprecedented detail. Film study is now augmented by software that tracks angles, speed, and movement patterns across hundreds of games. Every formation, down, and distance combination can be analyzed to optimize play selection. This level of sophistication is the culmination of the strategic seeds planted in 1958, where preparation and situational awareness began to outpace instinct as the dominant factor in winning games. No-huddle offenses exemplify the marriage of speed and strategy in modern football. By eliminating the traditional huddle, teams increase tempo, limit defensive substitutions, and create stress on coverage communication. These fast-paced drives require precise timing, situational awareness, and the ability to make rapid adjustments on the fly. The concept of tempo as a weapon, though dramatically amplified in the digital age, has philosophical roots in the principles of decision-making, anticipation, and exploitation that first emerged during the championship era. Offenses today are built to manipulate space and time, forcing defenses to respond faster than ever while providing quarterbacks with the freedom to execute calculated improvisation. Quarterbacks remain at the center of this offensive revolution. Players like Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and Justin Herbert exemplify the integration of athleticism, cognition, and improvisational creativity within highly structured systems. Each play is a synthesis of preparation, instinct, and execution. Quarterbacks study tendencies, communicate adjustments, and make decisions informed by both data and feel. The lineage of strategic thinking from 1958 is evident in their ability to process complex information while maintaining the freedom to deviate when opportunity presents itself. Modern offensive success is inseparable from this blend of intelligence and skill. The emphasis on preparation, data, and situational awareness has also influenced personnel evaluation and roster construction. Teams prioritize versatility, decision-making ability, and mental acuity as much as physical attributes. Receivers are now valued not only for speed and catching ability, but for route, precision, and football IQ. Offensive linemen are selected for adaptability and communication skills as much as raw power. Running backs must process defensive reads instantaneously while maintaining execution under pressure. Every player is evaluated as a contributor to the larger strategic system, a reflection of the meticulous planning that began in the NFL's formative years and evolved through the lessons of 1958. Defenses, in turn, have adapted to this modern offensive environment. Coordinators implement complex zone schemes, pattern-matching coverages, and disguises designed to counter high-tempo spread offenses and RPOs. The back-and-forth strategic evolution mirrors the chess match that unfolded in the late 50s between Landry and Unitas. Just as defenders of that era had to anticipate audibles and improvisation, modern defensive players must process pre-snap motion, offensive tendencies, and situational data in real time. The strategic complexity of football has escalated, but the fundamental principles of preparation, anticipation, and adaptability remain consistent with those first glimpsed in the championship game. Technological tools have accelerated the offensive revolution even further. Wearable sensors, tracking systems, and real-time analytics provide coaches and players with actionable insights during both practice and competition. Coaches can measure route efficiency, pass trajectory, and defensive alignment to fine-tune execution. Quarterbacks receive feedback that allows them to optimize reads and adjustments mid-game. The marriage of human skill and technological insight has created a game that is faster, more precise, and more cerebral than ever before, yet still rooted in the core principles of strategic awareness established in the late 50s. This modernization also extends to the mental preparation of players. Quarterbacks study digital simulations of defensive alignments, practice timing routes with advanced motion tracking, and analyze predictive models that anticipate opponent behavior. Receivers learn to recognize defensive tendencies before the snap and adjust routes accordingly. Offensive linemen rehearse complex blocking schemes under varying conditions to ensure consistency. The cognitive load of executing a modern offense is immense, reflecting the historical evolution from instinct-driven football to analytical, precise, and highly coordinated execution. The modern offensive revolution demonstrates that the legacy of 1958 is not only preserved, but amplified. Every no-huddle drive, RPO, and spread formation carries the DNA of that game. The principles of anticipation, preparation, and adaptive decision-making have evolved, integrated into sophisticated systems that leverage technology, data, and human creativity. Football remains a dynamic contest between offense and defense, but the tools available to orchestrate and execute strategy have reached unprecedented levels. Ultimately, the echoes of 1958 reverberate in every modern offensive play. The innovation of that championship game, the strategic foresight of coaches, and the intelligence of players created a blueprint for future generations. Today, spread offenses, RPOs, and no-huddle drives are not simply tactical novelties. They are extensions of the evolutionary trajectory that began with a single quarterback, a prepared coach, and a game that demanded both instinct and intellect. Modern football is faster, smarter, and more unpredictable. Yet it remains deeply connected to the foundational principles established over 60 years ago. The modern offensive revolution proves that football is a living system, continuously evolving yet firmly rooted in its historical foundation. The combination of strategy, preparation, analytics, and athleticism ensures that every snap is an opportunity to exploit opportunity, a testament to the enduring legacy of that transformative championship. The echoes of 1958 remain audible in every high-tempo drive, every read-option play, and every creative improvisation. A reminder that football's future is inseparable from its past. Revisiting the DNA of that night, Unitas' decisions as the blueprint for the sport. Soul, the night of December 28, 1958, forever known as the NFL Championship between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants, was more than a game. It was a moment in history where football, as it had been played for decades, transformed into something enduring, complex, and profoundly influential. That night, the sport's DNA was rewritten in real time, its principles codified in the choices of one quarterback, the preparation of one coaching staff, and the reactions of a team willing to embrace strategy over instinct. Johnny Unitas' performance was not only a display of athletic skill, but a blueprint for what football would become. Every throw, every audible, every orchestrated decision was a lesson in the power of preparation, intellect, and adaptability. The legacy of that night still resonates in every aspect of the modern game. The Colts' approach to that championship exemplified the fusion of instinct and strategy. Unitas did not act impulsively. He had studied tendencies, prepared for scenarios, and internalized a complex set of offensive strategies. Yet, when the moment demanded improvisation, he acted with precision and confidence, blending premeditated planning with creative execution. the legendary overtime drive where he guided his team down the field to tie the game and force sudden death, was not just a demonstration of athletic excellence, but a practical application of strategic foresight. Every decision was rooted in understanding risk, opportunity, and timing. And this combination of intellect and execution became the model for generations of quarterbacks and coaches. The impact of that night extended beyond the individual. Weeb Ewbank, the Colts head coach, quietly revolutionized preparation and offensive design. His meticulous attention to situational football, his use of film study, and his willingness to embrace planning over reliance on raw talent signaled a shift in how teams approached the sport. Coaches across the league recognized that success required more than instinctual athleticism. Football was no longer simply a contest of physical superiority. It had become a mental chess match, where preparation, adaptability, and analytical thinking could tip the scales between victory and defeat. The defensive schemes of the Giants under Tom Landry also contributed to the lasting influence of that night. Landry's approach, based on disciplined alignment, anticipation, and strategic innovation, tested the Colts offense in ways that demanded both preparation and creativity. The interplay between Unitas' improvisation and Landry's defensive intelligence created a dynamic that has become central to football's narrative, a contest not merely of strength or speed, but of intellect, anticipation, and adaptive decision-making. The lessons learned by both sides reverberated through decades of strategic evolution, informing philosophies from the Dallas Cowboys of the 1970s to the West Coast offense and beyond. The 1958 championship also left an indelible mark on the broader culture of football. The game was televised nationally, exposing millions of Americans to a contest where strategy, preparation, and execution were as important as athletic prowess. Fans witnessed a quarterback reading defenses, orchestrating audibles, and manipulating space with intelligence that rivaled his physical skill. The spectacle elevated the sport, demonstrating that football could be cerebral, dramatic, and emotionally resonant. Television transformed strategy into spectacle, creating a feedback loop that reinforced the importance of preparation, while inspiring generations of players and coaches to emulate what they had witnessed. Unitas' influence on subsequent generations of quarterbacks cannot be overstated. His ability to blend preparation with improvisation established a template for field leadership. Quarterbacks learned to study tendencies, read defenses, and execute under pressure with both precision and flexibility. From Roger Staubach to Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, and Patrick Mahomes, the lineage of quarterback intelligence can be traced directly back to that night. Each carries forward the lesson that success depends not only on athletic talent, but on the capacity to process, analyze, and adapt in real time. The sport's evolution is inseparable from the cognitive model Unitas embodied. Offensive philosophy, too, bears the imprint of that night. The integration of preparation, timing, and adaptability influenced coaching practices for decades. Systems were developed to structure execution while allowing room for decision-making. Plays became layered with options and contingencies, and the concept of the quarterback as a field general became codified. Strategy moved from reactive improvisation to proactive orchestration, creating the blueprint for modern play calling. That blueprint informs not only the NFL, but college and high school programs, embedding the principles of situational awareness, decision-making, and adaptive execution across every level of the sport. The legacy of 1958 extends to the relationship between player and preparation. The balance between instinct and planning established that night informs how athletes train, study, and perform. Quarterbacks dedicate hours to film, analysis, and scenario planning. Receivers and linemen refine timing and execution to integrate seamlessly into complex systems. Running backs practice reads and routes that anticipate multiple defensive alignments. This emphasis on mental preparation complements physical skill, ensuring that players can execute under the pressure of competition while maintaining adaptability. The cognitive demands of football, central to the modern game, are a direct extension of the principles demonstrated by Unitas and his teammates. The strategic DNA of 1958 also influenced defensive evolution. Coordinators studied the interplay between preparation and improvisation, recognizing that defensive schemes must anticipate offensive intelligence while remaining adaptable to improvisational acts. Linebackers, defensive backs, and linemen were trained to read keys, recognize patterns, and adjust in real time. The modern concepts of disguise coverages, zone rotations, cane pre-snap adjustments can trace their origins to the intellectual contest that unfolded during the Colts-Giants championship. The integration of preparation and adaptability on both sides of the ball remains a defining feature of the sport. Technological advancements have further amplified the legacy. Digital playbooks, tracking software, and analytical models provide coaches and players with insights that would have been unimaginable in 1958. Yet these tools do not replace the fundamental principles established that night. The game still rewards intelligence, decision-making, and execution under pressure. Technology has enhanced preparation and performance, but the strategic framework audibles, reads, anticipation, and situational decision-making remains unchanged. Football's evolution has expanded the tools available while preserving the core. Lessons of that pivotal championship. Culturally, the 1958 game cemented the quarterback as the central figure in American football. Unitas demonstrated that leadership, intellect, and the capacity to make decisions under extreme pressure are as important as physical skill. The quarterback became the architect of the offense, a concept that defines the sport to this day. This emphasis on cerebral leadership has shaped the way fans, analysts, and coaches view the game, creating a standard for excellence that transcends athleticism alone. Quarterback intelligence is now measured, studied, and celebrated, reflecting a legacy that continues to guide the sport's development. The championship also established a narrative framework for football as a contest of preparation versus improvisation, intellect versus athleticism, and strategy versus instinct. This framework informs commentary, coaching philosophy, and player development. Every high-pressure drive, every critical decision, and every improvisational act can be traced back to the principles demonstrated in that game. The 1958 championship crystallized football as a sport where victory depends on mastery of both preparation and execution, and where the human mind is as crucial as the human body. In examining the long-term effects, it is clear that the 1958 game was not a historical anomaly, but a point of inflection. It redefines the expectations for players and coaches, elevated the intellectual demands of the sport, and transformed the relationship between strategy and execution. Its influence is evident in modern offensive and defensive schemes, quarterback preparation, and even the cultural perception of football as a complex, strategic endeavor. Every game since has been built upon the lessons learned that night, with Unitas decisions serving as a touchstone for excellence. The story of 1958 is a story of transformation. It is a narrative of how one game catalyzed the evolution of an entire sport. Johnny Unitas audibles, the Colts' preparation, and the Giants' defensive intelligence combined to create a blueprint for modern football. The principles demonstrated preparation, adaptability, situational awareness, and improvisation continue to define the game. The night the Colts and Giants played in sudden death overtime remains a reference point for understanding football's intellectual and strategic evolution. Ultimately, the legacy of 1958 is enduring because it codified what football demands at its highest level. The ability to merge instinct with preparation, creativity with structure, and intelligence with execution. Every modern quarterback, every offensive system, and every strategic innovation owes a debt to that championship. The DNA of the game, established in that moment, continues to shape how football is taught, played, and understood. The decisions made by Unitas and the Colts that night were not simply tactical choices. They were lessons in the essence of football, guiding generations of players, coaches, and fans alike. The 1958 championship is more than a historical event. It is the blueprint for the soul of the sport. Its influence can be felt in every audibling quarterback, every calculated improvisation, and every meticulously designed offensive series. The game elevated strategy and preparation to an art form, transforming football into the cerebral and dynamic contest that captivates audiences today. Johnny Unitas' choices, in combination with his teammates and coaches, created a legacy that transcends statistics and championships. It defines what it means to play the game at its highest intellectual and athletic level. The night of December 28, 1958, at Yankee Stadium was more than a championship. It was a turning point, a convergence of talent, intellect, and circumstance that would forever redefine football. That sudden death over time between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants was not only a contest of skill and courage, 'twas a demonstration of how the human mind could reshape the sport. Johnny Unitas, with every audible and every precise throw, revealed the latent potential of strategy as a force as powerful as athleticism. The game had evolved from a test of instinct into an arena where thought, preparation, and foresight could determine victory or defeat. The 1958 championship planted a seed that would grow into the sophisticated, cerebral football of today. In the decades that followed, the NFL transformed into a laboratory of strategy. Coaches became architects, meticulously designing offensive and defensive systems that accounted for every conceivable scenario. Quarterbacks evolved into field generals, absorbing knowledge, studying tendencies, and executing with calculated precision. Playbooks expanded, film rooms multiplied, and analytics integrated into every decision. Football had become a game of preparation and intelligence, as much as one of physical prowess. The blueprint laid down in 1958 had been fully realized. Each snap, route, and audible carried echoes of that cold night in New York, of a quarterback manipulating space and time to orchestrate victory. Yet, with the rise of control came a subtle erosion of spontaneity. The artistry of improvisation, once a central feature of the sport, was increasingly constrained by expectation and structure. Quarterbacks were trained to process, calculate, and minimize risk. Every decision was weighed against probability charts and tendencies. Playcalling became a science, and the field a grid of predictability. The freedom of instinct, the rawness that once defined football, was subordinated to the architecture of the game. In the pursuit of perfection, the sport gained precision, but it risked losing some of its soul. The visceral unpredictability, the moments that felt unscripted yet profoundly human, became rarer. Even as football grew more intelligent, it became more demanding. The mental load on players intensified. Quarterbacks must process complex defensive schemes in microseconds, while receivers, linemen, and running backs all operate within tightly coordinated systems. Mistakes are magnified, and hesitation can be fatal. The speed and complexity of modern football, though spectacular, have created an environment where human instinct is only one part of a machine-like process. The genius of Unitas, the calm improvisation that defined the 1958 drive, is now a model to emulate, yet it exists within parameters that are far more rigid. The balance between preparation and spontaneity, once a delicate dance, is increasingly mediated by data and instruction. The rise of analytics and digital tools has brought unprecedented insight. Teams can measure tendencies, anticipate opponent behavior, and simulate scenarios with remarkable accuracy. Strategies are informed by probability, predictive modeling, and performance metrics. The game has never been smarter. Yet, as football embraces these innovations, it must reckon with what may be lost. The unpredictability that made the sport electrifying, the sense that a single decision born of intuition could change history, is diminished in a world dominated by calculated certainty. The thrill of raw instinct, the human element that made Unitas' drive unforgettable, remains, but it is now filtered through layers of strategy and analytics. Still, the evolution of the sport has not erased its emotional resonance. Football remains a theater of tension, risk, and triumph. The interplay between strategy and human creativity continues to produce moments of awe. Patrick Mahomes' improvisations, Lamar Jackson's audibles, and Brady's meticulous command of the game are contemporary manifestations of the principles first illuminated in 1958. The genius of preparation enables, rather than stifles, improvisation when executed by the right players. Chaos has returned in measured doses, a reminder that human skill and intellect are inseparable from the game's drama. The sport's soul persists, even as it becomes ever more sophisticated. The legacy of 1958 also underscores the importance of leadership and intelligence in shaping outcomes. Unitas was not the fastest, the strongest, or the most physically imposing player on the field. He was a thinker, a strategist, a man capable of reading the game as it unfolded and adapting to its unpredictabilities. His example established the quarterback as the locus of both intellect and execution. Every subsequent generation has aspired to this model, redefining the role and expectations of leadership in football. In this way, the 1958 championship did not just change how football was played. It transformed how it was understood. There is, however, a haunting tension between perfection and imperfection, between control and human fallibility. The sport's evolution toward meticulous planning and analytics has undoubtedly elevated the level of play. Mistakes are fewer, drives are more efficient, and games are often decided by precise execution rather than random circumstance. Yet in this pursuit of control, football has risked losing the sacredness of unpredictability. The moments that once felt like pure human magic, an instinctive throw, an improvised route, a split-second reaction that defied expectation, have become rarer. Precious reminders of what the game once allowed. The memory of those moments lingers as a benchmark against which all innovation is measured. Despite this tension, the story of football is ultimately one of integration. The intellect of preparation and the creativity of instinct are no longer in opposition. Modern players and coaches operate at the intersection of strategy and spontaneity, merging data-driven decision-making with human adaptability. The game has learned to think without losing its capacity to feel, to calculate without erasing artistry. The lessons of 1958 echo not only in how plays are called, but in how players approach their craft, how coaches structure systems, and how the sport continues to inspire awe. As we reflect on the legacy of that night, it becomes clear that the 1958 championship is not merely a historical event. It is the origin story of modern football, the moment when the sport demonstrated that intellect could elevate competition without erasing its humanity. Every audible, every pre-snap adjustment, and every improvisational act traces its lineage to that defining game. The principles established then: preparation, situational awareness, adaptive execution, and controlled improvisation remain embedded in the DNA of football, guiding every generation of players, coaches, and fans. The emotional resonance of that game endures because it speaks to something universal about human endeavor: the balance between control and freedom, planning and instinct. Preparation and execution mirrors the challenges faced beyond the field. Football, at its highest level, reflects the tension between what we can calculate and what we can imagine. It teaches lessons about adaptability, resilience, and creativity under pressure. The 1958 championship crystallized these truths, demonstrating that the mind can shape outcomes as decisively as the body. In the end, the story of the 1958 championship and its lasting influence is a story of duality. It is a story of intellect and instinct, control and chaos, strategy and soul. Football learned to think that night, and in doing so, it became a richer, more layered sport. Yet it retained, within carefully calculated moments of improvisation, the ineffable human element that makes the game thrilling and timeless. The legacy of that game is not confined to statistics or championships. It resides in memory, in the way the sport inspires players and fans, and in the eternal dialogue between strategy and the human spirit. As we look across the modern landscape of the NFL, from high-tempo spread offenses to precision-crafted playbooks, the principles established in 1958 remain foundational. The game has evolved, accelerated, and become infinitely more complex, but it has not abandoned its soul. The lessons of preparation, adaptability, and creativity continue to guide every drive, every decision, and every audacious moment on the field. Football's intellect and artistry coexist because of the night when strategy overtook instinct without sacrificing humanity. That night remains the compass by which the sport navigates both its past and its future. Ultimately, the 1958 championship is a testament to the enduring power of foresight, courage, and intelligence in shaping the game. It is a reminder that football is more than physical competition. It is a reflection of human potential, creativity, and resilience. In the interplay between control and chaos, between preparation and improvisation, the sport discovered its most compelling dimension. The memory of that night, the decisions of Johnny Unitas, and the foresight of his coaches continue to illuminate the game, revealing that the heart of football is not merely speed or strength, but the marriage of intellect and soul. Football learned to think that night, and in doing so, it taught us how to marvel at the endless tension between strategy and instinct, planning and improvisation, intellect and emotion. The legacy of 1958 endures not only in the modern game, but in the way it challenges us to consider what it means to excel, to adapt, and to create under pressure. Every snap, every audible, and every calculated improvisation carries a memory of that transformative night, reminding us that the sport's soul exists in the delicate balance between precision and possibility, between mastery and imagination, and between the enduring pull of strategy and the human spirit. The game learned to think. The memory of that night continues to inspire. The legacy of 1958 is eternal.